You are walking along a narrow path that begins where the flinty lane peters out into a tangle of hawthorn and elder. The morning is cool and very still, and the only sound is the soft crush of your own footsteps on the chalky soil. A low mist hangs between the beech trees, not thick enough to obscure the way, but enough to dampen the air against your cheeks and leave tiny droplets on the shoulders of your loose linen coat. The path you follow is barely more than a pressed-down line in the fallen leaves, a way that has been known to you for many seasons, and so your feet find the easiest footing without any need to look down too often. Around you the smooth grey trunks of the beeches rise like quiet pillars, their bark faintly mottled with patches of pale green lichen that seem to bloom in the filtered morning light. High above, the canopy is still closed tight with the fresh leaves of early summer, but here at ground level everything remains shadowed and damp and suspended in a kind of waiting stillness. As you walk, the air shifts gradually from the open scent of the fields you left behind to something richer and more enclosed, the odour of last year's beech mast trodden underfoot, and the faint earthy sweetness of rotting wood. You carry a canvas tool roll under one arm, its ties knotted loosely, and over your opposite shoulder hangs a leather water bottle that makes a small, dull slosh with each step. The weight of these things is familiar and not burdensome. A wood pigeon calls somewhere deeper in the trees, a low repeated coo that rolls out and then fades, and after it finishes, the silence seems even fuller than before. You do not hurry. There is no reason to hurry. The day will be long, and the work will fill exactly the time it needs, so each pace falls with a quiet, steady rhythm that merges with the pulse of the wood itself. After a short while, the path begins to slope very gently upward, a barely perceptible incline that tells you are moving onto the chalk spur that underlies this part of the Chiltern Hills. The soil becomes thinner here and there the white chalk gleams through where the track is worn. Your boots, which are stout leather with iron-shod heels, make a faint grinding noise on the scattered flints that poke up from the earth. You pause for a moment, not out of tiredness but simply to adjust the strap of the water bottle, and in that pause you notice the particular quality of the light filtering through the mist, how it turns the tree trunks into soft plains of silver and grey and makes the distances seem deeper and more hushed than they really are. Then you walk on, and the path narrows just enough that you turn your shoulders slightly to pass between two old beeches whose roots have grown together into a low, moss-covered mound. The clearing opens before you without any dramatic unveiling. One moment the trees are close, and the next there is simply more space, a roughly oval area where the ground has been kept free of undergrowth by generations of working feet. The canopy overhead is thinner here, so a wash of diffused light falls like watered milk onto the broad circle of leaf litter and wood chips that covers the ground. In the centre of the clearing stands the pole lathe, exactly as you left it at the end of the last working day. It is a simple-looking arrangement of wood, iron, and cord, but every part has a purpose that you know so intimately you could assemble it in the dark. The two upright posts, set firmly into the ground, carry the iron pikes that will hold the turning blank. A long spring pole, which is really a young beech sapling that was cut and left attached to its stump a few paces away, arches overhead with a gentle curve, its free end pointing down toward the lathe bed. A leather cord hangs slack from the tip of this pole, waiting to be looped around the work and connected to the treadle below. The treadle itself is a flat board of ash, worn smooth in the middle where your right foot always rests, hinged at one end by a leather thong to a buried block of wood so that it can rock forward and back. Nearby, a rough bench made from a split log sits on short legs, its top surface marked with the shallow scars of chisel points. You walk to this bench and lay down your tool roll, and the cloth makes the faintest whisper against the timber. For a long moment you simply stand and look around the clearing, allowing your senses to settle fully into the space. The mist is already beginning to thin, though it still clings in the hollows between the tree roots and drifts lazily around the pile of branchwood stacked at one side of the working area. That wood pile, which contains the beech blanks you will turn today, is a neat pile of sections cut last autumn and left to season under a covering of bark and bracken. You will go to it later, but there is no need to rush into it now. A robin, The very bird that has grown used to your presence over many quiet days flits down from a low branch and perches on the top edge of the bench, regarding you with a bright dark eye before flying off again into the undergrowth. The only other sound is the slow drip of moisture from the leaves above, a soft and intermittent patter that falls on the leaf litter with a sound like a mouse walking on dry paper. The world beyond the beech wood, with its coaches and markets and clamour, seems so distant that it might as well be part of another century entirely. You walk over to the lathe and stand before it, letting your gaze travel along its frame. The two upright posts are beech naturally, and their bark has been left on except where they needed to be trimmed to fit the iron centres. The drive centre, which is the pike on your right, has a small hand-forged spur that will bite into the end grain of the blank and make it turn. The tail centre, on the left, is a simple cone of iron that can be adjusted in and out by tapping a wooden wedge with a mallet. The wedge now sits in its mortise with a bit of sawdust still lodged in the crack from the last time he drove it home. The tool rest is just a forked branch that sits in a socket and can be moved closer or farther from the work by pulling out a peg and choosing another hole, and at the moment it is set for a piece that was thinner than the blanks you plan to turn today, so you make a mental note to reposition it later. The cord that drives the lathe is of rawhide, twisted and supple from use, and when you pluck it with one finger, it gives a low, dull note that hangs in the air for a moment before dying away. You step onto the treadle and press it down lightly, just to feel the resistance of the pole overhead. The pole bends, the cord tightens, and the whole frame creaks once. A sound that is more like the settling of an old house than the protest of a machine. You release the treadle, and everything returns to stillness, as if the lathe itself were only half awake and not yet ready to begin its day. Behind the lathe, the ground dips slightly, and you can see the worn depression where your left foot always stands, a shallow hollow that fits your boot sole so well it is as if the earth itself remembers your stance. The chips and shavings from previous work have been swept into a loose heap that is already darkening into compost, and a few fresh strands of last week's beech shavings still curl like pale ribbons on top of the pile, bleached almost white by the moisture of the nights. You pick one up and roll it between your fingers, feeling its papery thinness and the residual springiness that remains even after it has dried. The scent that rises from it is faint but unmistakable, a clean, slightly nutty perfume that lingers on your skin long after you let it fall back to the ground. This is the smell of beech wood freshly cut, and it is one of the quiet pleasures of the work that you never tire of. You leave the lathe for a moment and walk the perimeter of the clearing, not for any particular purpose except to inhabit the space fully before the labor begins. The beeches that surround you are old but not ancient, their trunks ranging from the thickness of a man's waist to the breadth of a barrel. Some bear the scars of branches that were lopped off long ago, the wounds healed over into smooth bosses of bark that swell like closed eyelids. The ground beneath them is a thick carpet of mast, the empty husks of beech nuts that crunched underfoot in the autumn, but now lie softened and half buried in the leaf mould. Here and there a few late bluebells still cling to life in the shadier corners, their leaves already yellowing and their flowers closed against the dim light. You notice a spider's web strung between two saplings, its silk beaded with mist droplets that catch the light and hold it like tiny lenses, and you stoop to look at it for a few peaceful seconds before moving on. Nothing in the clearing is in a hurry, and neither are you. Returning to the bench, you untie the knot of your tool roll and lay it open flat, revealing the chisels and gouges nested inside the canvas pockets. Each tool has its own slot, and the canvas is stained dark with linseed oil that has leached from the wooden handles and the steel blades over many months of use. You take out the roughing gouge first, a heavy tool with a deep U-shaped cutting edge and a handle of polished beech that fits perfectly into the hollow of your palm. You hold it up to the light and sight along its bevel, checking for nicks or dullness, and then wipe it with a rag that you retrieve from the bundle. The steel is cool and very smooth beneath your fingers, and the oil film left by the rag makes it gleam with a soft blue-grey sheen. Next comes the spindle gouge, slightly smaller, with a shallower sweep, that is ideal for the fine beads and coves you will cut later in the day. You lay this beside the roughing gouge on the bench, and then the narrow parting tool with its diamond-shaped cross-section, and finally a flat chisel that you use for squaring off the ends of the finished pieces. Each tool is examined and set down in a neat row, and the simple act of arranging them feels like a small ritual that marks the transition from arrival to work. The robin returns, this time to a branch directly above the bench, and it sings a short, fragmented phrase that seems more like a comment than a song. You look up and see its puffed-out chest, the orange feathers vivid against the grey bark, and you nod to it without thinking, a habit that has grown over the months of solitary labour. The bird tilts its head, then drops down to the ground and hops among the wood chips, pecking here and there for the tiny insects that gather in the decaying material. You watch it for a minute or two, letting your thoughts wander where they will. A slow breeze stirs the leaves high above, making a sound like a distant sea, though at ground level the air remains perfectly motionless. The dappled light on the forest floor shifts and shimmers as the branches sway, and the patterns it makes are intricate and infinite, never repeating themselves exactly. It would be easy to stand here all day just watching the light move, but after a time your body begins to feel the familiar impulse to start, a gentle readiness that is not exactly restlessness, but something close to it, the sense that the wood is waiting. You go to the stack of branch wood and begin the slow process of selecting the first blanks, but that is a task that belongs more properly to the next part of the morning, and for now, you're content just to stand among the beeches with the tools laid out in the lathe ready, the day stretching ahead like a long, smooth road with no turnings and no surprises. The mist has nearly gone now, drawn back into the earth and the leaves, and the forest has lost its silvery cast, becoming instead a warm, green-walled chamber filled with the quiet certainty of another slow and ordinary day in the Chiltern Hills during the 18th century. You take a deep breath and let it out again, and the sound of your own breathing blends with the creak of the lathe cords settling in the still air, and with the soft patter of the last dewdrops falling from the beech leaves to the ground. There is nothing else to do, nowhere else to be, and the clearing holds you in its gentle pocket of time, a place where the only measure of the hours will be the gradual growth of the pile of finished legs beside the bench and the slow movement of the sun through the leaves. You are here. The work will begin shortly, and the wood waits with the patience of a tree that has stood in this soil for 100 years. The stack of branchwood sits at the northern edge of the clearing, where the beech trees thin out just enough to let a little more light reach the ground, and you've walked toward it now with that slow, deliberate pace that belongs to the early part of every working day. The pile is not at all haphazard. It has been built with a kind of quiet order, the sections of wood laid in alternating courses, so that air can move among them and carry away the damp that would otherwise settle into the grain and turn it spongy with rot. Some of the pieces rest on two cross-laid logs that lift them off the soil, and the whole stack is capped with a rough thatch of bracken fronds that have faded from green to a brittle bronze. You reach up and pull away a corner of this covering, and the fronds crackle softly under your fingers, releasing a dusty herbaceous scent that mingles with the clean smell of the beech wood beneath. The branches were cut from a large beech that came down in a storm the previous autumn, its roots torn from the chalk by a great gust that swept up from the valley. The woodman, a quiet man from the village, had sectioned the larger limbs into manageable lengths with a two-handed saw, and you had carried these lengths into the clearing yourself over several afternoons, each one balanced across your shoulder while the leaves still clung to the twigs, and the fresh white ends of the cut bled a thin sap that dried into sticky amber beads. Now those ends have greyed with exposure, and the bark has tightened around the wood as the moisture slowly left it. But you know from long experience that beech is best worked while some of that original sap still lingers in the fibers, keeping it soft enough to cut cleanly and damp enough to polish under the edge of a sharp gouge. So the wood you are about to select has not seasoned fully. It is what the chair bodgers call green hard, neither sappy and wet nor brittle and dry, but somewhere in that middle state where it turns like butter on a warm day. You crouch down beside the stack and let your gaze wander over the ends of the pieces that protrude from the pile, each one showing its own particular face of grain and bark and pith. The first thing you always notice is the color, that pale honey cream of beech that darkens to a soft pinkish brown where the heartwood begins to form. Some of the ends display a neat central dot, which is the pith, surrounded by concentric rings that tell the story of quick summers and slow summers, wet seasons when the tree put on a wide band of growth, and dry years when the rings crowded close together like hairline cracks in old varnish. You reach out and touch one of these end faces, running your thumb across the rings, feeling the slight topographical difference between the harder late wood and the softer early wood, a difference so faint that only the most patient of fingertips could ever detect it. The wood is cool and smooth, almost waxy, and the thin layer of dust that has settled on it comes away on your skin like a very fine flour. You stand up again and begin to pull individual pieces out of the stack, working with the same unhurried rhythm that you bring to everything in the clearing. The first piece you lift is a straight section about the length of your arm from fingertip to elbow, which in the old measures is somewhere around 18 inches, a good starting length for a chair leg that will later be trimmed to its finished size of perhaps 14 or 15 inches. You hold it in both hands and sight along its length, closing one eye the way a carpenter does, checking for any waver or bow that would render it useless for a turned part. The eye can detect a deviation of even a fraction of an inch along a straight line, and this particular piece looks true enough that you set it aside on the ground next to the stack, a candidate worth a closer inspection later. The bark is still largely intact, a pale silvery grey that peels in thin, papery curls where the piece was handled roughly during transport, and beneath those curls the wood shows a clean, unblemished surface that promises a good, even grain. The second piece you draw from the stack is slightly thicker, perhaps from a lower branch that caught more of the tree's strength, and when you heft it, you feel the solid, satisfying weight of dense wood that will resist chatter under the gouge. You turn it over slowly in your hands, running your fingers along the bark, searching for the telltale bumps that indicate small knots, those places where a side branch once sprouted, and the grain flows around it in a turbulent eddy. A knot in the wrong place can make turning difficult, because the tool will catch on the harder grain, and the surrounding wood will tear out instead of cutting cleanly. And on a finished chair leg, a knot that lies too close to the surface can later shrink and fall out, leaving a dark hole that collects dust. This piece has one small knot about a third of the way up, but it is sound, meaning the knotwood has fused completely with the surrounding grain and shows no cracks or looseness. You tap it with a fingernail, and it gives back a solid click, not the dull sound of decay. So you set this piece next to the first one, already building a small family of chosen blanks that lean together like companions. The air in the clearing has begun to warm very slightly as the sun climbs somewhere above the canopy, and the mist has now vanished entirely, leaving the leaves glossy and the spiderwebs reduced to ordinary silk threads without their diamond droplets. You wipe your forehead with the back of your hand, a gesture more out of habit than need, and then return your attention to the stack. The third piece you examine gives you pause, because its bark is marked with a fine, wandering tracery that looks at first like a scribble of dark ink. This is the work of the beech bark beetle, a tiny creature that bores its galleries just beneath the outer layer and leaves patterns that are, in their own way, quite beautiful, like a map of rivers without names. But the beauty is a warning, because where the beetle has been, the wood may be stained with a bluish-grey discoloration that spreads inward from the tunnels. And while this spalting can sometimes be prized by woodturners for its decorative effect, you know that a chair leg must above all be strong and uniform in its color, without the hidden weakness that the fungus can bring. You peel back a loose piece of bark with your thumb and find that the wood beneath is indeed marked with a faint grey blush, not very deep but enough to make you shake your head and return the piece to the stack, laying it on top with its scarred side facing down so that you will not be tempted to try it again later. The fourth piece is a gift. It slides out of the pile as if offering itself, a perfectly straight length with a diameter that matches almost exactly what you need for the upper part of a chair leg, where the turning will taper only slightly before meeting the socket of the seat. The bark is thin and smooth, with the fine, silvery bloom that young beech branches carry, and when you run your hand along it, you feel none of the roughness that would indicate a twisted or spiral grain. The grain of beech is usually straight and dependable, but occasionally a tree will grow with a slight twist that makes the fibers run around the branch like the stripes on a barber's pole. Turning that is difficult to work, and legs that can warp over time as the tension in the wood slowly releases. You hold this piece at arm's length and rotate it, watching the way the bark seems to flow in an even line from one end to the other, and you nod once, satisfied, and add it to the growing collection. Now you have 3 good blanks, and you need only 1 more to make the morning's quota. So you spend a little longer at the stack, sifting through the remaining branches with the same patient attention that a cook might give to selecting vegetables from a market stall. You pick up a piece that is a touch too thin and put it back. You reject another that has a deep scar where a deer perhaps rubbed its antlers against a living branch years ago, leaving a wound that healed over with rough, corky bark. You find a section that seems promising but, on close inspection, reveals a hairline crack running from the pith outward along a radial line. A shake that probably occurred when the tree fell and the branch was wrenched away from the trunk. Such cracks can close up under the pressure of the lathe centers and become all but invisible, only to open again when the dry air of a cottage draws the moisture from the finished chair. So you set this one aside too, not with any frustration, but with the calm acceptance that comes from knowing that half of good work is simply choosing the right material. At last your hand closes around the 4th blank that will complete your set, a sturdy piece, a little shorter than the others, but thick enough to yield a good, stout stretcher, which is the crosspiece that will later connect 2 chair legs and bear the sitter's weight. Stretchers are simpler to turn than legs, being mostly straight, with just a bead or 2 at the ends for decoration, but they require the same strength and straightness of grain. And this piece has both. You pull it free and dust off the clinging leaves that have stuck to it, and then you gather all 4 blanks into your armload, cradling them the way you might cradle a bundle of firewood, and carry them across the clearing toward the lathe bench. The walk back is short, but you take it slowly, because the ground is uneven, with the remnants of old roots and the scattered flints, and you have no wish to stumble and chip the edges of your selected wood. You lean the blanks upright against the bench, arranging them so that their ends rest on the leaf litter and their tops lean at a slight angle into the natural hollow of the split log. They make a soft clatter as they settle, a dry sound like wooden chimes, speaking to one another in a single quiet note. You step back and look at them, these 4 pieces of a tree that stood for decades on the Chiltern slopes, breathing in the summer air and drawing up the chalky water through its roots. And you feel a quiet sense of connection, a thread of something that ties your own hands to the forest and to all the other Bodgers who have made this same walk and carried this same wood in all the long years before you. For a moment, you simply stand there, letting the stillness return to the clearing. The robin is back, perching now on the very top of the lathe spring pole, where it bobs up and down with the faintest movement of the sapling as if testing its balance. You watch the bird without really watching it, your mind lingering on the wood and the work that is ahead, but not in any way that feels pressing or urgent. The blanks lean there patiently, their bark catching the dappled light, and you know that inside each one is a chair leg already, a shape that already exists in the grain and only needs to be uncovered by the cutting edge of the gouge. This is a thought that does not come to you in words, but rather as a kind of quiet understanding that settles somewhere behind your ribs, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. The day continues to move around you in its slow arc, the shadows shifting almost imperceptibly across the far side of the clearing, and the beech leaves whisper among themselves in the high branches with a sound like a distant conversation you cannot quite make out. You take your water bottle from the bench and drink a small mouthful, the water cool and tasting faintly of the spring's moss and minerals, and then you replace the stopper and turn your attention back to the blanks, already beginning to think about which one you will mount first. That decision, like all the others this morning, will be made without hurry, and you know it will be the straightest one, the 4th piece that practically chose itself, but for now the choice can wait while you let the piece of the wood settle over you like a thin, soft blanket, covering everything that is not this clearing and this moment, and these 4 pieces of beech that hold within them the quiet promise of a chair still to come. Before any turning can begin, you find yourself standing beside the pole lathe and simply looking at it. This is not idleness, but a kind of introduction, a quiet moment in which you allow your understanding of the machine to settle and deepen. The lathe has been here a long time, perhaps longer than anyone in the village can say with certainty, and it has been maintained by the hands of many Bodgers before you, each one leaving behind small adjustments and tiny repairs that have accumulated into the particular arrangement you see now. The entire device is made from materials that grew within a few hundred paces of this clearing: beech for the upright posts, ash for the treadle board, hazel for the pegs that hold the tool rest, rawhide for the driving cord, and iron brought from the smithy for the two centers or pikes that grip the turning wood. There is a deep and satisfying completeness in this, the sense that everything needed to make a chair leg comes from the same soil and the same woods that surround you, and that the lathe itself is not so much a machine imposed upon the forest as a natural extension of it. The two upright posts that form the main frame of the lathe are set directly into the ground, their lower ends sharpened to points and driven deep into the chalky earth so that they stand firm and do not wobble even under the rhythmic push and pull of the turning day. Over time, the damp has darkened the wood at the base to a shade nearly as grey as the bark, and small clusters of pale fungi sometimes appear there in the autumn months, though now in early summer the posts are dry and clean. At the top of each post, a square mortise has been cut to hold the iron centers, and these mortises are packed with small wedges of scrap wood that can be tapped in or out to adjust the alignment of the pikes. This packing is a careful thing, built up over many test turns and many slight corrections, and it now holds the centers so perfectly in line that a string stretched from one pike point to the other would bisect the whole system like a drawn line of light. The post on your left, which holds the tail center, is fixed in place, but the one on your right can be shifted slightly by loosening the earth around its base with an iron bar, a rare adjustment that you have only had to make once since you first began working in this clearing. The tail center itself, the pike on the left, is a simple cone of iron about the length of your hand, forged to a smooth, dull finish by the blacksmith who supplies the village. Its tapered point is not needle-sharp, but blunted to a small, rounded tip that will press into the end grain of the blank without splitting it, and the body of the cone swells back from this tip in a gentle curve that fits comfortably into its wooden housing. Behind the tail center, driven through a slot in the upright post, is a small wooden wedge that serves as the adjustment mechanism. When you tap this wedge with a mallet, it pushes the tail center inward by a fraction of an inch, tightening its grip on the wood, and when you tap it back the other way, the center releases its hold. The wedge has a small split in its thicker end, an old crack that some previous user bound with a winding of thin cord to keep it from opening further, and this little repair, like so many on the lathe, has held fast for years without needing to be redone. You run your finger over the cord binding and feel the wax that was rubbed into it long ago, still slightly tacky under the warmth of your skin. The drive center on the right-hand post is a more complex piece because it must not only press into the wood, but also grip it and force it to rotate. This center has a central spur, a small iron tongue that bites into the end grain, and this spur is flanked by two shorter wings that engage the wood at an angle, preventing the blank from slipping as it turns. The whole assembly was hand-forged, and you can still see the faint hammer marks on the iron where the smith's blows shaped the metal while it glowed orange on the anvil. The drive center fits into its post in the same way the tail center does, seated in a mortise and secured with a wedge, but behind the post, a short length of cord connects the drive center's spindle to the overhead spring pole by way of a simple toggle that allows the cord to be attached and detached quickly at the end of each working day. This toggle is a small cylinder of boxwood, a dense and pale timber that polishes to a smoothness like ivory, and the cord passes through a hole drilled in its middle and is knotted on the far side to keep it from pulling free. The spring pole itself is the part of the lathe that visitors always notice first, because it sweeps upward into the air with a living grace that the other components lack. It is a young beech sapling, perhaps 15 feet from base to tip, that was selected many years ago for its straightness and its flexibility. The Bodger who first built this lathe cut the sapling with a single stroke of an axe just above a convenient stump, leaving the root system intact so that the end of the pole remains attached to the living wood of the forest floor. Because it was not severed from the earth completely, the sapling retained a degree of flexibility that a dead pole would not have. It can bend and spring back thousands of times without cracking, and even now, after many seasons of use, it still carries a few thin branches near its tip that produce a handful of small green leaves each spring, a reminder that the lathe is, in a small way, still alive. The pole arches over your head in a long, gentle curve, and a leather cord hangs down from its free end like a single line of drooping spider silk, swaying very slightly in the still air. When the lathe is in use, this pole bends downward each time your foot presses the treadle, and then springs back each time you release it, creating the reciprocating motion that spins the work first toward you and then away. The rhythm of this bending and releasing is the heartbeat of the whole operation, and after a few hours, your body learns to match it so perfectly that the lathe seems to become an extension of your own pulse. Beneath the poles in the center sits the treadle, the part of the lathe that your foot will work, and it is here that the machine meets the bodger in the most direct and physical way. The treadle is a board of ash, chosen for its toughness and its resistance to splitting, and it is about as long as your arm and as wide as your hand. Its upper surface has been worn completely smooth by the friction of thousands of hours of foot pressure, and in the very center there is a shallow depression where the ball of your foot always rests, a hollow so polished and dark with use that it gleams faintly even in the shadow of the lathe. One end of the treadle is hinged to a buried block of oak that was sunk into the ground when the lathe was first built. A strip of thick oxhide serves as the hinge, folded and pegged to both the treadle and the block, flexible enough to allow the board to rock through its full range of motion, but strong enough that it is never torn despite years of stretching and flexing. The other end of the treadle, the end nearest to you as you stand at the lathe, is free to move up and down, and it is from this end that a second leather cord rises to wrap once around the turning blank before continuing upward to the spring pole. The geometry of this arrangement means that when you press down with your foot, the cord pulls the blank around toward you, and when you lift your foot to let the spring pole return, the blank spins backward. The backward spin is idle, a time when no cut can be made, and so the work proceeds in a series of forward cuts interspersed with silent returns. A stop-start rhythm that might seem inefficient to someone accustomed to continuous rotation, but which, in practice, creates a natural cadence that allows the bodger's hands and eyes to rest briefly between each cutting stroke. The tool rest is a humble but essential component, and it is perhaps the part of the lathe that has been most often replaced and adjusted over the years. It consists of a forked branch, usually of hazel, that sits in a square socket cut into a block of wood pegged to the lathe frame. The fork is the part that matters because it provides a support for the chisel or gouge, a steady resting place that you can brace the tool against while its cutting edge meets the spinning wood. The two arms of the fork are worn to different depths, according to the various tools that have rested there, and the right-hand fork arm has a slight groove where the roughing gouge habitually sits, as if the wood has learned the shape of that particular tool over many repetitions. The tool rest can be moved closer to the work or farther away by pulling a peg and reinserting it into a different hole in the supporting block, a system that is simple but effective, and the pegs themselves are short dowels of beech that have been whittled to fit tightly into their holes without any need for glue or fastening. Several spare pegs lie in a little cluster on the bench, each one cut to exactly the same length, and they rattle softly when you brush against them, a sound that is so much a part of the clearing small music that you rarely even notice it. The cord that drives the entire machine is made from cowhide, tanned and twisted into a round, supple rope that is about the thickness of your little finger. It is not a single continuous loop like the belt on a spinning wheel, but a single length that begins at the treadle, rises to wrap around the blank, continues up to the spring pole, and then returns to tie off near the base of the upright post. The way the cord wraps around the blank is simple. It makes a single turn, passing over the top of the cylinder and dropping straight down, so that the two sections of cord, the one going up and the one going down, are parallel and close together, but never tangled because the geometry of the system keeps them aligned. The point where the cord wraps the blank is important. If it is too tight, it will chafe the wood and burnish a dark mark into the surface, and if it is too loose, it will slip and fail to turn the piece properly. You have learned through long practice exactly how much tension feels right, a pressure that lets the cord grip without crushing, and you check it by pressing a thumb against the cord where it crosses the blank, feeling the slight give that tells you everything is in order. The whole lathe stands in the center of the clearing like a kind of altar to the craft, and the ground around it bears the evidence of all the work that has been done here. A fine dust of beech shavings has worked its way into the soil, lightening its color and giving it a springy texture underfoot that is different from the compacted earth of the path. The chips and curls from countless turned pieces have been raked into a loose heap on the south side, where the sun hits them for a few hours each afternoon, and slowly bakes them into a dry, pale mass that smells like a bakery when you disturb it. And there, at the base of the right-hand upright post, a small depression in the ground marks the spot where your left foot always plants itself during the work, a hollow that has been worn smooth and hard by the repeated pressure of your boot sole, a physical record of every hour you have ever spent at this machine. When you stand in that hollow and press your foot down onto the treadle, everything aligns. Your hands fall naturally onto the tool. Rest, your eyes sight along the blank, and your body settles into the familiar, comfortable stance that will carry you through the long hours of the working day without fatigue. It would be possible to describe the chemistry of the materials, the molecular structure of the cellulose in the beech wood or the cross-linked proteins in the rawhide cord, but such descriptions do not belong in this clearing, where knowledge is not written in words but stored in the muscles and the fingertips and the quiet memory of the body. Instead, you simply stand beside the lathe, touching each part in turn, feeling the cool iron and the warm wood and the flex of the cord. And you know the machine the way a sailor knows the ropes of a boat, not by naming them but by having handled them in every weather and every season until your hands move toward them, before your mind can even form the thought. The light in the clearing shifts slightly as a cloud passes over the sun somewhere above the canopy, and the lathe seems to exhale, its various tensions relaxing just a fraction before the brightness returns and everything tightens back up again. You have now spent long enough in contemplation of the machine. The blanks are leaning against the bench, the tools are laid out, and your body is beginning to feel that gentle, pleasant readiness that comes just before the first cut of the morning. The robin has flown away to some other part of the wood, and the clearing is very quiet, as if the trees themselves are holding their breath, waiting for the sound of the cord beginning its steady, rhythmic stroke. You pick up the first blank and hold it in your hands one more time, feeling its weight and its straightness and the slight coolness of the beech wood against your palms, and then you step forward to mount it between the centers, bringing the day at last to the work that it has been quietly preparing for since the moment you first stepped onto the path through the beeches in the early morning mist. You reach for the straightest of the 4 blanks, the one that seemed to offer itself from the pile, and you carry it in both hands across the small distance to the lathe bench. The beech branch is cool against your palms, and its weight feels balanced, not too heavy at one end, a sign that the pith probably runs near the center along its whole length. You set it down on the bench, and then take up the small hand axe that lives in a split log holster at one end of the bench, its edge protected by a leather sheath that you slide off with a soft tug. The axe is a modest tool, its head about the span of your hand, forged from a single piece of iron, with a short ash handle that has been worn to a smooth, dark patina near the head from the grip of many afternoons. The edge is not razor sharp, but keen enough to bite cleanly into green beech without crushing the fibers, and you test it lightly against the pad of your thumb before beginning. A habit that has become so automatic you do it without any conscious thought. You pick up the blank and hold it vertically, with one end resting on a solid block of wood at your feet, the block that has been used for this purpose for so long that its top surface is scarred with 1,000 small axe marks, a cross-hatching of shallow cuts that overlaps into a texture like rough linen. The first strokes of the axe are aimed at removing the bark, and you work with a series of light, glancing blows that peel away the silvery outer layer in long, curling strips. The sound is a quiet, rhythmic tapping, not the heavy thud of a woodsman felling a tree, but the patient tap-tap of a carpenter dressing a small piece of stock. Each strip of bark that falls away releases a small puff of that sweet, nutty scent, and the pale wood beneath is revealed inch by inch, creamy and faintly cool to the touch. You rotate the branch slowly, working around its circumference, and within a few minutes the entire surface is bare, except for a few stubborn patches near the very ends, which you clean off with a final careful pass. The strict blank looks clean and almost luminous against the dark background of the forest floor, and you set it down on the bench for a moment while you brush the bark scraps into the growing pile of shavings that will slowly compost back into the earth. Now you must prepare the ends of the blank so that they can be mounted securely between the iron centers of the lathe. The end that will engage the drive center, the right-hand pike with its spur and wings, needs to be shaped into a rough tenon, a slightly tapered cylinder that will fit snugly against the iron and allow the spur to bite deeply into the end grain without shifting. You pick up the blank and hold it horizontally across the bench, Then take up the axe again and begin to trim the first inch or so of one end, reducing its diameter with careful, controlled strokes that follow the natural lines of the grain. The beech cuts easily, still carrying enough moisture from its time in the forest to part before the edge like a wedge of firm cheese, and the chips that fly off are small and curled, catching the light as they tumble. You work slowly, turning the branch a quarter turn between each cut so that the tenon takes shape evenly, and every few strokes you pause to sight along its length, checking that it is round and centered and free of any flat spots that might cause it to wobble when the lathe begins its spinning. The tenon does not need to be perfect. The iron centers will tolerate a slight irregularity, and the final truing of the cylinder will happen once the piece is mounted and rotating. Still, the closer you can bring it to roundness now, the less chatter there will be when the gouge first touches the spinning wood. So you take your time, letting the axe do its quiet work until the tenon is a tidy, tapered stump that fits comfortably into the hollow of your cupped hand. The opposite end of the blank, the one that will rest against the tail center, needs less preparation because the tailpike is a simple cone that presses into the wood without requiring any gripping surface. You do trim it lightly, just enough to remove the roughness of the original saw cut and to ensure that the end is square to the length, so that the pressure of the tail center will be distributed evenly and not at an angle that might force the piece out of alignment. A few soft strokes with the axe, a quick check by standing the blank on its end on the bench and seeing that it does not lean, and then you are satisfied that the blank is ready to be mounted. You carry the prepared blank to the lathe and stand before the upright posts. The tail center on the left is currently pressed hard against the drive center, the wedge driven in tight from the last time the lathe was used, because at the end of each working day you always loosen the cord but leave the centers closed to keep the dust and damp from settling on the iron points. You take up the small mallet that hangs from a peg on the left-hand post, a mallet made from a solid knot of elm wood with a handle whittled down to fit the hand, and you tap the tailstock wedge lightly on its upper end to loosen it. The wedge slides back with a faint creak. The tail center retracts by 1/4 of an inch, and the gap between the two iron points opens just enough for you to insert the prepared blank. You lift the blank and fit its drive end onto the spur of the drive center, pressing it firmly against the iron until you feel the central point bite into the end grain and the two wings engage the wood on either side. Holding the blank steady with your left hand, you reach for the mallet with your right and tap the tailstock wedge forward again, gently at first, then with a little more force as the tail center meets the other end of the blank and begins to seat itself. You stop frequently to check the alignment, sighting along the blank from the side to see that it runs parallel to the framework of the lathe, and you adjust the pressure of the wedge in tiny increments until the hold is secure, but not so tight that the wood begins to compress or the fibers start to groan under the load. There is a particular feel to the correct pressure, a kind of solid resistance in the wedge that tells you the blank is gripped firmly without being crushed, and your hands know this feeling so well that you barely need to think about it. When everything is right, the blank sits between the two centers like a spoke in a wheel, able to rotate freely when the cord pulls it, but with no slack or wobble in its bearings. Now comes the cord, the loop of rawhide that will transfer the motion of your foot and the spring pole to the blank. You lift the loose cord from where it hangs over the tool, rest its leather surface cool and slightly slick from being rubbed with tallow to keep it supple, and you pass it under the blank from the back, then over the top from the front, so that it wraps once around the wood at a point about a handspan to the right of the center. The single turn should be snug but not tight. It needs to grip the cylinder firmly enough to turn it without slipping, but not so firmly that it digs a groove into the beech or chafes the surface before the turning even begins. You adjust the position of the cord by sliding it along the blank, finding the sweet spot where the tension from the spring pole will pull straight down without any tendency to shift sideways. Once you are satisfied, you let the lower end of the cord drop to the treadle, and you bend down to loop its end through the iron ring set into the treadle board. This connection is a simple knot, a bow line that can be untied with a single pull at the end of the day, and you check it now by giving the cord a gentle tug to make sure it is secure. Everything is ready. The blank is mounted, the cord is in place, and your tools lie in their neat row on the bench. You step forward into the worn depression in the earth, the hollow that your left foot has made over all the days that have come before, and you rest your right foot on the treadle board. The board sits flat under the ball of your foot, and you can feel through your boot sole the slight vibration that travels up from the iron ring and through the rawhide cord, a faint hum that is not yet a sound, but a suggestion of one. You place your left hand on the tool rest, not to hold any tool but simply to steady yourself, and you take a breath and let it out slowly, allowing your body to settle into the familiar stance. Then you press down with your right foot. The treadle descends under your weight, and the cord tightens instantly. Above your head, the long beech pole bends into a deeper curve, its free tip pulling downward as the rawhide transmits the force you have applied. The blank rotates toward you with a soft, low sound, the iron spur turning in its socket with a tiny squeak, the wood shifting against the tail center with a whisper of friction. You hold the pressure for a heartbeat, feeling how the whole machine responds, and then you lift your foot and let the treadle rise. The spring pole, released from the pull, straightens back to its resting position, and the cord slackens and reverses direction, spinning the blank away from you with a second, quieter sound, a kind of exhalation that follows the first intake of motion. You press down again, and again the pole bends and the cord sings tight and the wood turns toward you. You lift, and the pole springs back and the wood retreats. The cycle repeats, and after a few seconds the rhythm becomes steady and predictable, a slow heartbeat of bend and release, that measures the time not in seconds, but in the simple bodily cadence of your own foot and weight. The sound of the lathe starting up is a composite of several small noises that blend into a single hypnotic whole. There is the creak of the iron pikes in their wooden mortises, a sound like an old door that has been oiled and can no longer complain, only murmur. There is the thrum of the rawhide cord as it passes over the blank, a low resonant note that changes pitch slightly, depending on how hard you press the treadle, because a firmer pressure makes the cord tighter and raises its vibration by the smallest fraction of a tone. There is the soft whisper of the blank itself as it spins, the faint hiss of air moving over its bare surface, a sound so quiet you might miss it if you were not standing so close with your head bent in concentration. And above everything there is the voice of the spring pole, a gentle wooden groan that comes not from any distress but from the bending of long elastic fibers, a sound that is as natural to the clearing as the rustle of beech leaves or the distant call of the wood pigeon. You stand there for a while, not cutting anything, just letting the lathe turn and getting the feel of this particular piece of wood. Each blank has its own character, a slightly different weight and density that changes the way the treadle responds under your foot, and you need a few minutes to learn these subtle differences before you can trust your hands to guide the gouge accurately. This blank is a little heavier than the one you turned last week, perhaps because it came from a lower branch that grew more slowly and packed its rings more tightly together, and the extra weight means the pole bends a fraction deeper and the return stroke is a fraction slower. You adjust your foot pressure to compensate, pressing a little more lightly on the downstroke and allowing the pole to do slightly more of the work on the upstroke, until the rhythm feels balanced and effortless. It is not a matter of conscious calculation. Your body simply adapts the way a rower adapts to the weight of a different oar or a walker to the slope of a new path, and after a minute or two the lathe is running as smoothly as it has ever run. The robin has returned to its perch on the tool rest peg, apparently unbothered by the movement and the noise, and you catch a glimpse of its orange breast out of the corner of your eye. The bird watches the spinning blank with a tilted head, perhaps mistaking the motion for something alive, and then it flits away again into the undergrowth, where the spiders and beetles are more interesting than a turning piece of beech. You smile without smiling, a small inward acknowledgement of the bird's company, and then you turn your attention back fully to the work. The blank is now spinning in a steady, reliable way, and its pale surface blurs slightly in your vision because the rotation is just fast enough to soften the edges of the grain lines. You can hear the tiny irregularities that you will shortly remove with the roughing gouge, each one making a faint tick as it passes under the cord, and you mark these in your memory so that you will know where to begin your first cuts. The sound pattern has settled into a predictable loop. The press of the treadle, the creak, the thrum, the whisper, the release, the softer creak of the pole returning, the slacker thrum, the brief silence before the next press. It is a sound that, once you have heard it for an hour or two, gets inside your bones and stays there. A rhythm that you will carry with you even after you have left the clearing and walked home through the dusk, still feeling the ghost of the treadle under your foot and the swing of the pole in your lower back. This chapter of the day is just beginning. The first mounting and the first revolutions of the blank, and the real work of the gouge is still a minute or two away. But for now, the lathe is alive and the clearing is filled with its quiet music, and you are exactly where you need to be. You reach for the roughing gouge where it lies on the bench, its handle facing toward your dominant hand, and you close your fingers around the smooth beech wood that has been worn to a soft velvety polish by the grip of your own palm over many seasons. The handle is slightly worn from resting in the patch of sunlight that has crept across the bench, and its shape is a simple cylinder that flares gently at the end to prevent your hand from slipping forward onto the steel. A shape that has not changed in 100 years because it does not need to change. The blade of the gouge extends from a short tang that is driven deep into the handle and secured with a tight iron ferrule, and the steel itself is a deep U-shaped channel that curves upward at the cutting end to form a broad, sweeping edge. This edge is ground to a bevel that catches the light in a thin, silver line, and it is this bevel that will support the cutting action, riding on the wood as the sharp tip peels away the high spots. You carry the gouge to the lathe and stand once more in the worn hollow of earth, the rawhide cord still humming its steady rhythm as the blank turns toward you and away, toward you and away. You set the gouge down on the tool rest with the gentle care of someone placing a spoon beside a plate, and you adjust the rest itself by pulling out the small peg and moving the forked branch slightly closer to the work, so that the tool will have firm support directly beneath the point of contact. The peg slides back into its new hole with a soft, dry click, and you test the rest by pressing down on it with the heel of your hand, feeling its solidity. The tool rest is the bridge between your body and the spinning wood, and if it is set too far away, the gouge will chatter and bounce, leaving a rough surface full of tiny ripples. While if it is set too close, you will not be able to angle the cutting edge properly. You have found the right distance through long experience, a gap of about the width of 2 fingers between the rest and the blank, and you know it as much by the position of your elbows and the angle of your wrists as by any measurement. You lift the gouge and bring its curved edge up to the spinning cylinder without quite touching it, holding it just a hair's breadth away so that you can feel the faint breeze of the rotation on the knuckles of your left hand, which cradles the blade from underneath while your right hand grips the handle. The blank is turning at its steady working speed, not fast enough to blur the grain lines completely, but quick enough that the surface appears smooth and continuous, a pale ghostly column in the shadow of the canopy. You shift your weight slightly from your left foot to your right, settle your shoulders, and then you ease the gouge forward that last fraction of an inch so that its cutting edge kisses the wood. The first cut is so light that it barely makes a sound, a whisper like a page being turned in a very large book, and a single fine shaving lifts from the surface and curls back over the top of the gouge before falling away into the pile below. This shaving is not a chip or a flake, but a continuous ribbon of beech wood, thin enough to see through and pale as fresh cream, and it has come from one of the high ridges left by the axe work, a long, uneven bump that ran the length of the blank and now disappears under the steady pressure of the tool. The scent that rises from the cut wood is immediate and unmistakable, a clean, nutty sweetness that fills your nostrils and lingers at the back of your throat, a smell that is warmer and more complex than the dry scent of the bark scraps and reminiscent of freshly baked bread crust, as if the wood were releasing in an instant all the stored sunlight and rain of its years of growing. You press the treadle again and take a second cut, overlapping the first by half a shaving's width, and a second ribbon joins the first, and the smell deepens and spreads out into the still air of the clearing. You begin to work the gouge along the length of the blank, moving it slowly from right to left with a steady gliding motion that follows the rhythm of the lathe. On each downstroke of the treadle, when the wood spins toward you, you advance the tool and make a cut, and on each upstroke, when the wood spins away and no cut is possible, you ease the pressure and allow the gouge to ride lightly on the surface without biting, ready to engage again on the next forward rotation. This stop-start rhythm might seem inefficient to a modern mind, but it creates a natural breathing pattern for your hands and your whole body, a sort of slow dance in which the tool moves forward and rests, like a boat rocking gently on a calm sea. The sound that accompanies this dance is a steady two-part whisper, the sharpening sigh of the cut, followed by the softer hush of the return. Over and over, a lullaby of friction and release that you have heard so many times it has become indistinguishable from silence. As you move the gouge along the blank, your hands learn the topography of the wood in the most direct way possible, through the vibrations that travel up the steel blade, and into the handle, and then into the bones of your fingers. The high spots resist the cut with a slightly harder push, making the gouge hum with a tighter note, while the low spots allow the tool to pass over them without cutting at all, and the overall sensation is like running your hand over a relief map of a landscape you cannot see but can feel in perfect detail. The blank is not yet a true cylinder. It is an irregular polygon of many shallow facets left by the axe, and your first goal is to remove these facets and bring the piece to roundness. You do this by taking a series of light, overlapping passes, never trying to remove too much wood in a single cut, because a deep cut would dig in and stall the lathe or tear out a chunk of grain, leaving a gouge that would have to be turned away with even more labor. The beech wood parts willingly under the sharp edge, each ribbon curling up like a lock of hair from a carpenter's plane. And gradually, the profile of the blank begins to change. The irregular, wavering line of the surface becomes smoother to the eye, and the light, which had been catching the high spots in bright dashes and leaving the low spots in shadow, now spreads out into a more even band of illumination. You pause the lathe after a few minutes of this roughing work, lifting your foot from the treadle and letting the pole come to rest, the cord slackening and the blank coasting to a stop. In the sudden quiet you can hear the robin again, somewhere off to the left, and the distant murmur of the wind in the high beech leaves, sounds that had been covered by the thrum and whisper of the turning, but never entirely absent. You reach out and touch the surface of the partly turned blank with the tips of your fingers, feeling its new roundness and checking for any remaining flat spots or ridges. The wood is slightly warm from the friction of the cuts, a gentle heat that is not at all unpleasant, and its texture is changing already from the slightly fuzzy roughness of the axe-dressed surface to the satiny smoothness that a sharp gouge always leaves behind. You rotate the piece by hand, running your fingers around its full circumference, and you find a small ridge near the left end where you had not quite blended the cuts together, a subtle bump that the eye would never catch but the fingertip detects immediately. You make a mental note of its position, and then step back onto the treadle, bringing the blank up to speed again so you can address that one small imperfection with a final, feather-like pass of the gouge. The roughing continues for a long while, and the time passes in that particular way that only happens during repetitive handwork, where the minutes are not counted, but instead merge into a single, flowing duration that is measured only by the growing pile of shavings beneath the lathe and the gradual straightening of the blank's profile. You stop periodically to check your progress with the notched strip of wood that serves as your template, and each time you do this you turn the lathe off, let the blank coast to a standstill, and lay the strip along the cylinder at several different points. The template is a simple thing, a length of thin beech itself, cut with a series of step notches that correspond to the diameters you need at various places along the finished leg, and you hold it against the spinning work with one hand while you rotate the piece with the other, sighting along the edge to see where the wood is too thick or thin. At this early stage, the template is not yet a precise guide. You are simply using it to ensure that you are not removing too much wood in one area and creating a dip, a common mistake among beginners who chase the high spots too aggressively and end up with a leg that looks like an hourglass. You are no beginner, and your passes with the gouge have been so even that the cylinder is true to within a whisker along its entire length, a testament not to any particular skill, but to the simple patience of letting the lathe and the tool do the work at their own pace. You wipe the edge of the gouge clean with the rag that hangs from your belt, a habit that you repeat every few minutes to keep the cutting edge free of the sticky sap residue that beechwood sometimes leaves behind. The rag is a scrap of old linen, stained dark with linseed oil and wood dust, and it smells of both the oil and the polish of many cleanings. You inspect the bevel of the gouge after wiping it, holding it up to the light, and the edge gleams back at you with a thin, wicked sharpness that promises many more hours of cutting before it will need to be honed on the oil stone. Satisfied, You return the gouge to the tool, rest, and begin the next stage of the roughing, which is to blend the entire surface into a single, continuous cylinder that feels smooth to the touch from one end to the other. This is done not by changing the tool or the technique, but simply by continuing what you have already been doing, moving the gouge back and forth along the blank in long, even strokes that overlap each other by half, so that the final surface is composed of thousands of tiny, shallow valleys that together form a perfectly cylindrical whole. Your hands learn to apply exactly the same pressure at the beginning, middle, and end of each pass, and your foot learns to maintain a perfectly steady treadle speed, so that the shavings that fall from the gouge are all the same thickness and the same pale color, curling into a soft, springy mass around your ankles. As the cylinder takes shape, the sound of the lathe itself begins to change in a subtle way. An irregular blank has a slightly uneven rotation, each high spot causing a tiny fluctuation in the speed and tension of the cord, and these fluctuations create a wobbling note in the sound, a kind of warbling that is not unpleasant, but which changes as the piece becomes rounder. A true cylinder turns with a much purer sound, the cord humming at a steady, unwavering pitch, the iron centers turning in their mortices with a smooth, silent glide, the air whispering over the surface in an unbroken sigh. You hear this change happening gradually over the course of the morning, and it is a kind of music in its own right, a signal that your work is progressing as it should without any need to look or measure. The beech leaves overhead seem to listen, and the dappled light on the forest floor pulses gently with the slow, rhythmic sound, a visual echo of the steady beat of the treadle. At last, after what might have been half an hour or might have been an hour, you stop the lathe for a final check and run your fingers along the length of the blank from one end to the other, feeling with your eyes closed for any deviation from perfect roundness. The surface is cool and smooth now, almost glassy under your touch, and the grain lines that were once faintly visible have been turned into a continuous creamy expanse that shows the faintest hint of the ring structure as a fine, even tracery, the shadow of the growth years repeated along the length. There is no high spot, no flat place, no waver. The cylinder is true, and its diameter matches the notch template at every measuring point. You open your eyes and look at what you have made so far, which is not yet a chair leg, but the foundation from which the leg will emerge, and you nod once to yourself, a small private acknowledgement that the first stage is done. The robin comes back and lands on the bench, pecking at a crumb that is not there, and the late morning sun has now climbed high enough that the clearing is filled with a warm, settled light that seems to bless the quiet work of the wood turning, and the patient hands that have performed it. With the blank now a true smooth cylinder spinning between the iron centers, you take a step back from the treadle and let the lathe coast to a gentle stop, the cord going slack and the overhead pole swaying once, twice, before settling into stillness. The clearing seems very quiet after the long rhythm of the roughing cuts, and you use this pause to let the small muscles in your hands and forearms relax for a moment while you consider the next task, which is the marking out. A chair leg is never just a plain rod. It carries a few simple, graceful turnings that speak softly of the country tradition, beads and coves and gentle tapers that will catch the light in a cottage room and please the hand that wraps around them when moving the chair. These shapes must be placed exactly where they belong, the same on every leg of the set, so before you pick up any tool you must lay down the measurements that will guide the cutting. You go to the bench and take up the marking pencil, which is not a pencil in the modern sense, but a strip of plumbago, a dark, crumbly form of graphite that the travelling chapman brings from the mines in the north, tied with a winding of pack thread to hold it together and give your fingers something to grip. The strip is about the length of your little finger, and the thread has been wound so tightly that the graphite inside is compressed into a solid mass that leaves a dark silver line on the pale beech wood. You test it on a scrap of shaving, and the line appears as a faint metallic grey that will be easy to see but will not stain the wood deeply enough to survive the final smoothing cuts. This pencil is a small precious object, and you keep it in a niche under the bench where it will not be lost among the shavings, sometimes wrapped in a bit of oiled cloth to protect it from the damp. With the pencil in one hand, you walk back to the lathe and rotate the stationary blank by hand, slowly. studying its length as you decide where the turn details will fall. The leg you are making today is for a common kitchen chair, the sort with a square seat of elm and a frame of beech, and its design is one you have turned so many times that your hands could probably shape it without any marks at all. But you always mark out anyway, because the habit is part of the craft, and because even a practiced eye can wander on a long afternoon. You have a wooden rule in your head, a memory of the lengths and divisions that govern this pattern. But you also have a physical story stick, a thin lathe of beech with the key dimensions notched onto its edge, and you fetch this from the bench and lay it alongside the blank, on the tool, rest, aligning its end with the tail center end of the cylinder. The notches in the stick correspond to the positions of the beads, the coves, and the points where the leg will taper and where it will pass through the seat. You run a fingertip from one notch to the next, reading the stick like a silent score, and then you pick up the pencil again and transfer each position to the spinning wood by touching the tip to the surface at the appropriate points while you rotate the blank slowly with your other hand. A series of fine silvery rings appears around the cylinder, each one a boundary between the different sections of the turning, and when you're finished, you stand back and check that the marks are evenly spaced and square to the axis. Because a wandering line here would lead to a wandering profile later, the marks are simple and few. One pair defines the upper bead, another pair brackets the central cove, and further marks indicate where the lower taper begins and where the foot of the leg will be reduced to a neat, narrow peg. You put the pencil and the story stick safely aside, and then select the first tool you will use for this detailed phase, the parting tool. The parting tool lives in the campus roll between the spindle gouge and the flat chisel, and its shape is quite distinct from the others. The blade is a narrow, flat bar of steel that terminates in a diamond-shaped point, sharpened on both sides so that it can cut equally well in either direction, and its purpose is to make clean, straight-sided grooves that separate the different sections of the turning. The handle is slimmer than that of the roughing gouge, and it fits into your hand with a delicate, precise feel, as if the tool were asking for a lighter touch and a more focused attention. You check the edge against the light, find it still keen, and carry the parting tool back to the lathe. Stepping once more into the worn spot of earth, you press the treadle down and bring the blank up to a slow, steady rotation, slower than you used for the roughing cuts because the parting tool requires a careful, deliberate entry and a light hand. You rest the blade on the tool, rest with its diamond point aimed at the first of the silvery pencil lines, the one that marks the beginning of the upper bead, and you ease the tool forward until the tip just grazes the spinning wood. A very fine, dark line appears, hardly deeper than the pencil mark itself, and you hold the tool perfectly still for a few revolutions, letting it cut itself a small, true groove that will guide the rest of the cut. Once the groove is established, you advance the tool a tiny fraction deeper with each successive forward stroke, the bevel rubbing against the side of the cut and keeping it perfectly vertical. The shaving that emerges is not a broad ribbon like the roughing gouge produced, but a thin, dusty curl of wood that crumbles almost as soon as it falls, and the sound is higher pitched, a sharp, clean hiss that cuts through the background hum of the lathe like a single violin note, rising above a drone. You deepen the groove to the depth specified by the story stick, a depth that your fingers know as surely as your eyes, and then you withdraw the tool and let the lathe spin freely while you shift your stance slightly to address the next pencil mark. The process repeats for each of the defining grooves, and with each one you pause to check that the cut is square and that the ridges between the grooves are exactly the right width. The parting tool leaves behind it a series of narrow, shadowed rings that break the cylinder into a set of distinct compartments, and already the blank is beginning to look less like a pole and more like the skeleton of a chair leg. The shavings from this phase are thin and dark-edged, and they collect in a small, separate heap behind the main pile, a heap that has a finer texture and a different smell, slightly more resinous, because the parting tool cuts through the denser latewood rings with a different kind of friction. With the defining grooves cut, you put the parting tool down and take up the spindle gouge, the tool that will shape the actual beads and coves. The spindle gouge is a medium-sized tool with a shallow U-shaped blade that is ground at a tighter angle than the roughing gouge, and its bevel is a little longer, allowing it to pivot and roll smoothly through the intricate curves of the turning. You wipe its edge with a linen rag, even though it was not used since its last sharpening, and you notice again the particular gleam of a well-honed bevel, a sort of liquid brightness that seems to move as you tilt the tool in the light. You mount the spindle gouge and the tool rest, tilting the handle slightly upward so that the cutting edge is presented at a steeper angle to the wood, and you begin the first bead. A bead is a small, rounded convex curve, like a ring of dough rolled and placed around the leg, and it is formed by a controlled rocking of the gouge through a precise arc. You start the cut at the top of the bead, where the parting groove has defined its upper edge, and you push the gouge forward with a light, even pressure, while simultaneously rolling the tool handle downward and to the right, pivoting the bevel against the wood so that the cutting edge sweeps around the curve in a single, flowing motion. The motion is not strict and mechanical, but rather a smooth, continuous roll that comes from the elbow and wrist working together, almost like the gesture of turning a doorknob very slowly. As the gouge makes its journey across the bead, a thin, continuous shaving lifts from the wood, curling up into a little hollow tube that slides across the top of the blade and falls neatly onto the pile. The resulting surface is a perfect even curve that swells outward from the groove and then returns to the original cylinder diameter at the other side, and it catches the soft light of the clearing in a bright, shimmering line that runs along its highest point, a line that will later be polished to a silky gloss by the rubbing of a handful of shavings. You pause the lathe for a moment to examine this first bead, and you rotate the piece slowly with your hand, feeling the curve under your thumb and checking that its profile is symmetrical and that it transitions smoothly into the adjacent cylinder without any shoulder or step. A step, any tiny flat spot interrupting the curve, would be felt immediately by the sensitive pad of a fingertip, and so you feel each bead you turn with your eyes half closed, trusting the touch more than the sight. Satisfied, you return the lathe to motion and begin the second bead, which lies just below the first, with a short, straight section between them, and then you move on to the third and any further beads that the pattern calls for. Each bead is turned with the same hypnotic rocking motion, but no two feel exactly the same, because the wood varies subtly in density as you move along the grain, and your hands make tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments to the speed of the roll and the pressure of the cut to keep the curve perfect. Your body has begun to sway gently with the treadle now, a slight, rhythmic translation of weight from one hip to the other that matches the rise and fall of the cord, and the spindle gouge seems to move of its own accord, guided by a memory stored not in your mind, but in your arms and shoulders. Next, you turn your attention to the coves. A cove is the opposite of a bead, a concave hollow that scoops inward and creates a shadowed recess, and it is cut with a different gouge called a cove gouge, though many bodgers simply use the same spindle gouge and alter the angle of presentation. You do keep a slightly deeper gouge for coves, one with a tighter U-shape that can dig into the wood and scoop it out without leaving a flat bottom, and you take this tool from the roll now and prepare its edge with a fresh wipe. The cove cut is made by pushing the gouge into the wood at the center of the marked section and then swinging the handle to one side and then the other, creating a sweeping hollow that is deepest in the middle and fades out to the original diameter at both edges. You enter the wood slowly, letting the tip of the gouge find a center of the cove, and then you roll the tool smoothly to the left, cutting the left half of the hollow before withdrawing and repositioning to cut the right half in a matching arc. The intersection of the two cuts forms a smooth, continuous curve, and the resulting cove has a soft, dark interior that looks like a tiny, shadowed valley when the light strikes it from above. The shavings that come from the cove cut are tighter and more crumbly than those from the bead, and they often have a little twist in the middle, where the gouge changed direction, and you brush them away with the back of your hand so that they do not catch under the tool, rest and interfere with the cut. The alternating rhythm of bead and cove, convex and concave, is one of the quiet pleasures of the chair bodger's day, a visual song of light and shadow written in beech wood. Your hands learn each new shape as it comes, and you move from one detail to the next with a smooth, unhurried pace, the treadle keeping its steady beat beneath your foot and the overhead pole bending and releasing in its ancient, elastic rhythm. The sound of the cove cutting is deeper and softer than that of the bead, a murmuring note rather than a bright hiss, and when you close your ears to everything else you can hear, the difference like a call and response, bead and cove trading phrases in a language made of vibration and grain. The whole lathe seems to join in this quiet conversation, the cord thrumming in sympathy and the wooden frame creaking its gentle approval. Below the detailed section of beads and coves comes the taper, where the leg gradually narrows toward its foot. You mark the start of the taper with a last light groove from the parting tool, and then you return to the roughing gouge for this section, using it with a much lighter touch than you did during the initial cylindrical turning. The taper is a subtle thing, a reduction in diameter that is almost too faint for the eye to measure, but which gives the leg a balanced, grounded look when it stands in its finished socket. You work the gouge along the taper in long, sweeping passes that begin at the groove and travel downward to the end, each pass removing a hair-thin shaving and gradually sloping the cylinder from thick to thin. The angle of the taper is stored in the story stick and in your own sense of proportion, and you test it often by running your fingers along the length, feeling for any sudden change that would disrupt the smooth flow of the line. The foot of the leg, at the very bottom, is turned down to a small, neat peg that will later fit into the mortise of the lower stretcher, and this peg you shape with the parting tool and the spindle gouge, making a short, square-shouldered cylinder that has a clean, functional look, the kind of detail that makes a joint strong and true without any need for decoration. As the morning advances, the pile of shavings grows noticeably around the base of the lathe, and the turned leg begins to emerge from what was once a rough branch, like a sculpture from a block of marble, though the analogy is far too grand for the simple, homely beech wood that will spend its life in service under a kitchen table. The leg is still attached to the waste wood at both ends, the unturned stubs that will be cut off later, but between those stubs the shape is complete, a series of gentle beads swelling outward, a soft cove hollowing inward, a subtle taper descending to a neat peg, all arranged in a quiet, unassuming order that speaks of a long-standing tradition of proportion and restraint. You stop the lathe at last and take a step back, wiping your forehead with the sleeve of your coat, and you look at what you have made with the same calm, measuring gaze that you would give to any everyday thing. Not with pride exactly, but with the steady satisfaction of a job that has been done correctly so far. A job that has used the tools and the wood and the time exactly as they were meant to be used. The robin has been joined by a second bird, a smaller, duller-colored partner, and the two of them hop together among the fresh shavings, picking out the tiny insects that have been disturbed by the turning. You watch them for a minute or two, allowing your hands to rest on the tool rest without any tool in them, and you feel the pleasant tiredness that has begun to settle into your shoulders and the small of your back. A tiredness that is not yet fatigue, but only the gentle aftermath of several hours of rhythmic movement. The sun is higher now, and the clearing is warm and bright, the beech leaves filtering the light into a green-gold wash that makes everything look softer and more distant than it really is. The turned leg stands between the centers, its beads and coves catching the light in a series of delicate highlights, and you know that after a short rest and some bread and cheese, you will return to the lathe and begin the second leg of the day, repeating the whole process again with the next blank that leans against the bench, waiting its turn in the patient silence of the Chiltern wood. The lathe slows and stops as you lift your foot from the treadle for what feels like the last time in a long while, and the overhead pole straightens with a soft, satisfied creak before settling into a perfect stillness that seems to spread outward into the clearing. The sudden absence of the rhythmic thrum and whisper that has filled your ears for the past several hours is almost a sound in itself, a sort of gentle, ringing quiet that takes a few moments to recede. You stand for a brief space with your hands resting lightly on the edge of the bench, feeling the last vibrations fade from the wood under your palms, and then you straighten up and roll your shoulders once, twice, loosening the muscles that have been held in the same attentive posture since you first mounted the blank. There is a pleasant, tired warmth running through your arms and the back of your neck, the kind of honest weariness that comes from steady, unhurried work, and it tells you that the morning has advanced far enough that a pause for something to eat would not be out of place. You take the linen rag from your belt and wipe your hands carefully, working the cloth between each finger and over the knuckles where a fine, pale dust of beech has settled into the creases of the skin. The rag is soft with age and stained with a permanent greyness that no washing will ever remove, and it smells of linseed and wood and the faint salt of your own sweat. When your hands are reasonably clean, You fold the rag and tuck it back into your belt, and then you leave the lathe area, stepping over the low mound of fresh shavings that has grown up around the treadle like a drift of curly snow. The shavings crunch softly under your boots, and the scent of them rises up afresh, that warm, bready perfume that you have been breathing all morning, but which still holds a small note of pleasant surprise each time you disturb a new layer. You walk across the clearing to the edge where a large beech has fallen long ago, and its trunk has been partly cut away to leave a low, smooth-topped log that serves as a seat. The log is thick with moss on its north side, a deep, soft green cushion that is cool to the touch, and its top surface has been worn to a gentle polish by many restful pauses, like this one. You lower yourself onto it with a quiet sigh, feeling the solid mass of the wood beneath you, and the slight give of the moss against the back of your legs. The view from this seat is different from the working view. Here you can see the clearing as a whole, the lathe standing in its patch of dappled light, the bench with the tools laid out in their neat row, the pile of unturned blanks still waiting, and above everything, the great canopy of beech leaves that filters the sky into a shifting mosaic of green and gold. It is a good spot, chosen long ago by someone who understood that even the simplest of meals tastes better when eaten in a place that feels like a shelter given by the trees. From beside the log, you retrieve a small cloth bundle that you left there earlier in the day, a square of coarse linen tied at the corners into a loose knot. You place it on your lap and work the knot free with patient fingers, the fabric resisting slightly because it has tightened with the damp of the morning air. The knot loosens all at once, and the cloth falls open, revealing the food that you packed before you left your cottage. In the thin grey light of dawn, there is a heel of brown bread, its crust dark and thick and dusted with a faint bloom of rye flour, and beside it a piece of hard cheese that has been wrapped in a few broad nettle leaves to keep it from drying out. The nettle leaves have wilted over the hours, their stinging hairs long since rendered harmless by the pressure of the cloth, and they peel away from the cheese with a soft green scent that is both sharp and fresh, like cut grass left in the shade. You lay the leaves aside on the log, where they will later be crumbled and scattered back into the undergrowth, and you rest the bread and cheese on the open cloth in your lap, taking a moment simply to look at them. The bread was baked 3 days ago in the stone oven beside your cottage, and it has grown a little firm, which is how you like it, because a firm bread makes you chew slowly, and the chewing itself becomes part of the rest. The cheese came from a farm at the edge of the beech wood, a hard, crumbly cheese made from the milk of sheep that graze on the chalky slopes, and its surface is mottled with a natural rind that carries the faint bloom of the dairy cellar. You pick up the bread and break off a piece with your fingers, the crust cracking slightly and sending a few crumbs down onto the cloth. The inside of the loaf is a soft brown, dense, and even, with the small irregular holes that speak of a long slow rising by the warmth of the hearth. You put the piece into your mouth and begin to chew, and the first taste is the mild sourness of the rye mingled with the nutter, earthier flavour of the whole wheat that the miller ground last autumn. The bread is chewy in a pleasant way, giving your jaw a slow, steady rhythm to work with, and as you chew, you notice how the sound of your own eating is the only sound in the clearing, a soft, internal noise that is very different from the external sounds of the lathe. You swallow and take another bite, and then you break off a small knob of the cheese and set it on the next piece of bread. The cheese is pale yellow and a little dry, and it crumbles as you press it down, the tiny fragments settling into the pores of the bread. The taste when you bite into the combination is sharp and salty, a clean, bright note that cuts through the mild sourness of the bread, and the two flavors together make a simple, complete mouthful that needs nothing else. You chew slowly, letting the textures change from firm to soft, and you look out across the clearing with a gaze that is not really focused on anything in particular, but is instead resting on the general warmth and stillness of the late morning. The sun is high enough now that its rays, broken by the beech leaves into 1,000 shifting coins, have moved across the floor of the clearing and now lie in a broad, bright patch that covers the heap of shavings and the lower part of the lathe. The light makes the turned leg that is still mounted between the centers gleam like a rod of honey, the beads and coves catching the brightness in soft, rounded highlights that change as the leaves above move in the breeze. It is a breeze that you cannot feel at ground level, because the beech trunks are so close together and the clearing sits in a slight hollow of the hill, but you can hear the breeze clearly enough, a long, distant rustle that passes through the canopy like a slow, invisible hand brushing over the top of the wood. The sound rises and falls, with a rhythm that is as steady and as calming as the treadle itself, and it blends with the occasional soft chatter of a distant blackbird and the nearer, more domestic murmur of the flies that have begun to dance in the warm air above the shavings. The whole clearing seems to breathe in the quiet, a slow, deep breath of earth and leaf and timber, and you breathe with it, letting your shoulders drop and your spine relax against the solid bulk of the log. The robin that has been your companion all morning has not gone far. You see it now, a small round shape of brown and orange hopping among the wood chips at the base of the lathe. Its movements are quick and precise, a few short hops, a tilt of the head, a darting stab of the beak into a fold of shaving where some tiny insect has been hiding. Every now and then the robin pauses and looks directly at you, its small black eye bright and curious, and you meet its gaze without moving. The two of you sharing a moment of quiet mutual regard that has been repeated so often it has become a kind of friendship, though a friendship without any need for language or acknowledgement. The bird seems to understand that you are at rest, because it ventures a little closer than it normally would, hopping onto the end of the log where you sit and then off again, as if testing the boundary of your stillness. You break off a tiny crumb of bread, no larger than a grain of wheat, and let it fall onto the ground at your feet, not as a deliberate offering, but more as a simple sharing of the abundance of the moment. The robin sees it immediately, hops over, tilts its head twice, and then snatches it up and flies a short distance away to eat it in private, disappearing into the low tangle of brambles at the edge of the clearing. You watch it go with the same slow, gentle attention that you have given to every other small event of the morning. You return your attention to your meal and eat the last of the bread, saving a final piece of cheese to finish on its own, letting its sharpness linger on your tongue after the bread is gone. The nettle leaves that wrap the cheese have left a faint herbal residue on your fingers, and you rub them together, releasing a clean scent that is like a memory of the hedgerow where the nettles grew. You then reach behind the log for the leather water bottle that you carried into the wood, and you pull out the wooden stopper with a soft pop. The water inside is cool, the leather having kept it shaded from the warmth of the clearing, and when you tilt the bottle to your lips, the water slides over your tongue with a freshness that tastes, as it always does, of the mossy spring under the old oak where you filled it. There is a slight mineral quality to the water from that spring, a faint chalkiness that is the signature of the Chiltern Hills themselves, and it cleanses the last of the cheese from your palate and leaves a clean, cold line all the way down your throat. You take a second mouthful, holding it for a moment before swallowing, and then you replace the stopper and set the bottle aside on the log next to the empty cloth. For a while, you do nothing at all but sit. The log is comfortable in the way that only a piece of timber can be, shaped by wear, to accept the weight of a seated body, and the moss on its side gives off a faint, earthy dampness that cools the air just around your legs. You let your hands rest on your thighs, palms up, and you feel the small calluses on your fingertips, and the slight stiffness in the joints of your thumbs, the physical reminders of the morning's work that will fade as the day goes on. Your breathing has slowed to a calm, even rhythm that matches the rustle of the beech leaves, and your thoughts have become loose and unfocused, drifting from one small observation to another without any need to follow them up. A woodlouse crawls slowly over a twig near your foot, its segmented back glinting in the light, and you watch it make its laborious way across a miniature landscape of leaf veins and soil crumbs. A pair of white butterflies spiral upward through a shaft of sunlight, their wings flashing in and out of visibility until they disappear into the canopy. The lathe stands silent in the middle of the clearing, the cord hanging slack and the spring pole casting a thin curved shadow on the ground, and it looks not like a machine waiting to be used, but like a piece of the forest itself, as much a part of the wood as the fallen log you are sitting on. The late morning quiet is not a complete absence of sound, but rather a very gentle gathering of small sounds that somehow combine into a silence of their own. The rustle of the leaves above is the loudest of these, a continuous sighing wash that sounds almost like water running over stones. Beneath it there is the occasional creak of a branch rubbing against its neighbor, a sound so soft that you are only aware of it when it stops, and the faint, high-pitched drone of a solitary bee that passes somewhere near your head and then fades away into the distance. There is also the tiny ticking sound of the shavings settling on the heap, a dry, almost inaudible rustle as the curls of wood shift and relax into themselves. A sound that you can only hear if you are perfectly still and not listening for anything in particular. And beneath everything there is your own heartbeat, a steady, felt pulse that has been your companion through all the hours of turning and which now seems to keep time with the slow sway of the beech leaves, as if you and the tree and the lathe were all part of the same long, quiet rhythm that has been going on since the first beeches took root in these hills. You do not feel any hurry to return to the work. The second leg will still be there when you stand up and walk back to the lathe, and the wood will not spoil or complain. There is a kind of luxury in this unhurried pause, a space in the middle of the day that has no purpose except to let the body rest and the mind drift, and you accept it without guilt or calculation, the way the robin accepts the crumb or the leaves accept the light. You lean back slightly on the log, pressing your palms against the rough bark behind you for support, and you tilt your head to look up through the canopy. The beech leaves are still young and tender, their edges slightly serrated, and their color a translucent green that glows when the sun shines through them. Against the pale blue of the sky they form a dense, layered pattern of light and shadow, a natural stained glass that shifts with every breath of wind, and you can see the veins of each leaf as fine, dark lines that radiate from the central stem like the bones of a tiny fish. The sight is so absorbing that you forget for a while that you are looking at it, and you simply let the pattern fill your eyes without naming or thinking, in the same way that you might listen to a familiar song without attending to the melody. A thin strand of spider silk, almost invisible, drifts across your line of sight, catching the light for a moment before vanishing again, and the robin returns to its perch on the tool, preening its feathers with a brisk, efficient motion that sends a tiny puff of down floating into the air. The cheese is gone, the bread is gone, the water is gone, and the cleared cloth lies empty on your lap. The warmth of the sun has soaked into your shoulders and the top of your head, and a pleasant drowsiness is beginning to settle behind your eyes, the kind of drowsiness that is not quite sleep, but is instead a soft, blurry borderland, where the senses are quiet and the mind rests on the edge of dreaming. You close your eyes for a brief moment, not to sleep, but just to feel the darkness behind your eyelids, and to listen more closely to the rustling above, and the soft hum of the bee that has returned. And in that small darkness the world of the clearing seems even larger and more peaceful than before. A vast green living room that extends outward in every direction, full of roots and earth and slow-turning seasons. When you open your eyes again, the quality of the light has shifted very slightly as it always does, the high sun having moved a little to the west so that the shadows now fall at a slightly different angle. The lathe, which had been half in shade, is now fully illuminated, and the turned leg seems to glow with its own inner light. The sight of it reminds you that there is more work to be done, but the reminder is gentle and carries no command. You sit for a few minutes more, gathering the quiet around you like a blanket, and then you fold the cloth carefully, tucking the nettle leaves inside it for later scattering, and you place the water bottle on top of it next to the log. You stretch your arms out slowly, feeling the muscles in your back and shoulders lengthen and release, and you take one last deep breath of the clean woodland air, which carries now the faint lingering scent of bread and cheese and the ever-present perfume of beech shavings drying in the sun. The rest has done what it was meant to do, which is to smooth away the small tensions of the morning and leave behind a calm, quiet readiness, but you do not leap up or break the spell with any sudden movement. Instead, you rise slowly from the log, brushing a few stray crumbs and a fragment of dried moss from your lap, and you stand for a moment looking at the clearing, the lathe, the waiting blanks, the patient tools, all of them exactly as they were when you sat down, and yet somehow refreshed and new, as if they too had been resting alongside you in the friendly silence of the Chiltern wood. The rest has left a gentle stillness in your limbs, a quiet readiness that is not yet the full energy of morning, but something softer and more settled, like the embers of a fire that have been banked and are waiting to be stirred. You rise from the log seat at the edge of the clearing and walk back toward the lathe, your boots making the same soft crunching sound on the wood chips that they have made all day, a sound so familiar now that it barely registers as a separate noise, but rather as a part of the clearing's own breathing. The turned leg still stands between the centers, its beads and coves clean and finished, and you pause to look at it for a moment before reaching for the mallet and tapping the tailstock wedge free. The wedge slides back with a dry wooden plaque, the pressure on the blank releases, and you catch the finished piece as it drops gently into your waiting hand. It is warm from the friction of the turning, the beech wood smooth and almost silky under your fingers, and you hold it up to the light to check that all the details are as they should be before carrying it over to the bench and leaning it carefully against the log with the other completed parts. This leg will join its fellows soon enough, but for now it rests, its grain already beginning to settle and oxidize in the dappled air. You select the second blank from the three that remain leaning against the bench, and this time your hand closes around the piece that had the small sound knot, the one you examined and accepted back when the morning was still new and the mist was only just lifting. You had noted then that the knot was solid and fully fused with the surrounding wood, no cracks or decay, and you had set it aside as a blank that would turn well enough with a little extra care. Now you lift it and hold it in both hands, turning it over to reacquaint yourself with its particular character. The bark has already been stripped away, and the exposed surface shows the pale cream-colored beech with its faint, even grain lines running the length of the piece. But you can feel under your thumb the slight bump where the knot lies just beneath the surface, a small dark eye that looks back at you without any threat. The knot is the place where a tiny side branch once sprouted and then died back, and the tree grew around it, encasing the old wood in new rings until it became a solid, seamless part of the larger branch. You know that when the gouge reaches this spot, the wood will be harder, and the grain will swirl in a tight eddy, and that knowledge settles into your hands as a small, quiet adjustment that will make itself felt when the moment comes. You prepare this second blank in exactly the same way you prepared the first, taking up the hand axe and trimming the ends to form the rough tenons that will fit into the iron centers. The axe work is a repetition of the earlier motions, and your body slips back into them with a kind of grateful familiarity. The short glancing blows, the slow rotation of the branch, the careful sighting along its length to check for roundness. But even as the motions repeat, the wood itself feels subtly different. This branch grew at a slightly different angle on the parent tree, and the grain that was once straight and even on the first blank now has a faint, almost imperceptible spiral to it, a gentle twist that runs around the branch in a long, lazy helix. The axe reveals this twist in the way the chips lift away, some of them curling to the left instead of falling straight, and you note it without comment or concern. Just another small variation in the endless variety of the same material. With the ends trimmed and the tenon shaped, you carry the blank to the lathe and mount it between the centers, tapping the tailstock wedge home until the iron pikes grip the wood with that familiar, firm pressure that allows rotation without wobble. You loop the rawhide cord around the blank at the same spot as before, a hand span to the right of center, and you adjust the tension with a few light tugs until it feels right. The cord's snug, but not straining. Then you step into the worn hollow in the earth, your right foot finding the polished depression on the treadle board, and you press down. The lathe comes to life again with its creak and thrum and whisper, the overhead pole bending into its gentle curve, and the second blank begins to spin, its surface a pale blur in the afternoon light. The roughing stage on this second piece begins as it did on the first, with the same broad gouge and the same steady, sweeping passes, but the spiral grain announces itself almost immediately. On the first blank, the gouge had cut with an even, consistent resistance, the shavings peeling away in long, continuous ribbons that fell straight down into the pile. On this blank, the shavings still curl and fall, but you notice that on the forward stroke, when the lathe turns the wood towards you, the cut is a little rougher, the sound a fraction higher pitched, while on the return stroke, which is the idle spin, the gouge rides more smoothly over the surface. This is because the spiral grain means that the tool is cutting against the lie of the fibers on one rotation and with the lie on the other, and your hands, without any conscious instruction from your mind, begin to adjust the angle of the gouge's bevel by the tiniest of degrees. You tilt the handle a hair to the left, you lighten the pressure by an ounce. You let the edge find its own path through the wood rather than forcing it to cut against its natural inclination. These adjustments are so small that an observer standing next to you would see no change at all, but your fingertips Feel the improved quality of the cut immediately. The shaving becoming uniform and smooth on both strokes, the sound settling back into its familiar, low whisper. The roughing continues with this new, slightly adapted rhythm, and the blank gradually gives up its high spots and its slight irregularities, slowly becoming a true cylinder. You pause the lathe occasionally to run your fingers over the surface, and you feel the spiral grain now as a very subtle texture under your skin, a faint diagonal ridging that is too fine for the eye to see, but which the touch can trace like the lines on a seashell. It is not a flaw, this spiral, merely a characteristic, and you know that the finished leg will be just as strong and just as straight as the first one. Because beech is a forgiving wood that holds together well even when its grain is not perfectly aligned with the axis of the turning. You make a few extra passes with the gouge in the area where the spiral is most pronounced, taking off the thinnest of shavings, and then you are satisfied that the cylinder is true. The marking out follows, using the same story stick and pencil, and you lay down the fine silvery rings that divide the cylinder into its sections for the beads and coves and tapers. The process is identical to the earlier one, but you find that your hand is a little slower now, a little more deliberate, not from any tiredness, but from the deeper calm that always settles over the afternoon hours. The morning had its own energy, a kind of brisk readiness that carried you through the first roughing and the first careful cuts, but the afternoon brings a different quality, a more meditative pace in which the repetitions of the work become not just a task, but a kind of quiet, ongoing mantra. Each pencil mark is made with the same attention, yet the act feels less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something that has been going on for a very long time and will keep going on long after the shadows have stretched across the clearing and the tools have been put away. The parting tool follows the pencil, cutting its narrow defining grooves, and then the spindle gouge comes out for the beads. You turn the first bead with that familiar rolling motion of the wrist and elbow, and the bevel glides smoothly around the curve, the shaving lifting in a fine, tubular curl. This bead looks and feels exactly like the beads on the first leg, and that is the point. Each leg in the set must match its neighbor so that the finished chair sits squarely and pleases the eye with its symmetry. The repetition of the shape is not a boredom, but a reassurance, a proof that your hands can reproduce the same gentle curve time after time without any loss of precision. You move on to the next bead, and then the one after that, the rocking motion becoming so automatic that your mind is free to wander lightly, touching on small, unimportant things, and then letting them go, drifting across the surface of the afternoon like a leaf on a slow pond. The sound of the gouge on the beech is a steady, rhythmic hiss that blends with the creak of the lathe and the distant rustle of the canopy, and the three sounds together form a kind of music that is without beginning or end, a continuous sleepy drone that fills the clearing. When the gouge reaches the area of the sound knot, you feel it before you see it. The resistance under the blade changes suddenly, becoming harder, and the note of the cut rises to a tighter, sharper pitch. You lighten your pressure instantly, lifting the gouge just enough that it still cuts but does not dig, and you slow the treadle a fraction so that the cut proceeds with more control. The knotwood is denser and more brittle than the surrounding beech, its grain a dark, swirling vortex that resists the smooth, rolling motion, and if you were to force the tool through it at the same speed and depth, the blade would chatter and tear out a ragged chip, leaving a rough patch that would have to be painstakingly smoothed. But you do not force it. You let the gouge find its own gentle way around the knot, taking the thinnest possible shaving, and the bead forms slowly but cleanly over the dark spot, incorporating it into the curve without any visible flaw. The knot, when the bead is finished, appears as a small dark fleck in the pale wood, a tiny eye that will look out from the finished chair leg and remind anyone who notices it that this piece of wood was once a living branch on a living tree. You pause the lathe and inspect the knot area closely, rubbing it with the pad of your thumb. The surface is perfectly smooth. The transition from the soft early wood to the hard knot is seamless, and you nod once to yourself before continuing on to the cove that comes next. The cove on this second blank is cut with the deeper U-shaped gouge, and the spiral grain that affected the roughing also makes its presence felt here, though in a more subtle way. On the left-hand side of the cove, where the cut travels with the grain, the gouge scoops out the hollow with a soft, murmuring sound, and the shavings curl into tight little spirals that drop neatly away. On the right-hand side, where the cut travels against the grain, there is a slightly greater resistance, and the shavings tend to crumble rather than curl. You compensate for this by adjusting the angle of the gouge again, presenting the cutting edge a fraction more steeply to the wood, and the difference is so small that you could not describe it in words or teach it to another. But your hands have learned it now, and they will remember it for the next time a spiral-grained blank finds its way onto the lathe. The cove takes shape as a smooth, symmetrical hollow that matches its counterpart on the first leg, and the shadow inside it has the same soft, dark quality that makes the cove seem deeper than it really is. The taper and the foot peg follow, and you work the roughing gouge down the lower portion of the leg in those long, sweeping, overlapping passes that you have made so many times today that they feel less like a series of discrete actions and more like a single, flowing movement that repeats itself endlessly. The mind, when it is fully absorbed in a rhythmic task, has a way of stepping aside and letting the body take over, and you are now in that state where the work is doing itself through you rather than being done by you. The treadle rises and falls under your foot, the pole bends and releases, the gouge slides along the wood and returns, and the pile of shavings grows incrementally, one thin curl at a time. You are aware of all these things, and yet not aware of them. The way a sleeper is aware of the rain on the roof without waking, and the whole experience is as calm and as seamless as the wood itself. At some point during the turning of this second leg, the light in the clearing begins to change. The sun has moved far enough to the west that the shadows of the beech trunks, which were earlier short and pulled around the bases of the trees, are now lengthening across the floor of the clearing in long blue-grey fingers that reach toward the lathe and the bench and the pile of shavings. The quality of the light itself is different too, losing the bright, sharp clarity of midday and taking on a warmer, deeper, more golden tone that makes the beech leaves blow and the turned wood gleam with a richer honey color. You notice this change without interrupting the rhythm of your work, just a fleeting observation that passes through your mind and leaves behind a gentle appreciation, and then you go back to the steady, unhurried progress of the gouge along the taper. The shadows stretch a little further each time you glance up, and the robin that was your companion all morning and early afternoon has now retired to a higher branch, where it sings a short, soft phrase of notes that sound like a question, and then falls silent. The second leg is finished at last, and you stop the lathe and remove it from the centers, adding it to the growing collection leaning against the bench. Beside the first leg and the two stretchers you have already completed, it makes a small, neat family of turned beech parts, all matching in their dimensions and their quiet, understated detail. You run your hand over the second leg, comparing its feel to the first, and you can detect the slight, subtle difference that the spiral grain has imparted, a faint diagonal texture that the first leg does not have. But you know that in a week or two, when the wood has fully dried and been smoothed and polished and assembled into its chair, no one will ever notice it except perhaps another Bodger, who will run a knowing thumb over the surface and smile at the small secret of the tree that gave its branch for this chair. You pick up the third blank from the stack and look at it for a moment, then set it down again, and decide to take a short pause, not for food or water, but simply to let the late afternoon stillness wash over you before beginning the next piece. You walk to the edge of the clearing and stand with your back against a smooth beech trunk, feeling the cool bark through the fabric of your coat, and you look out over the lathe and the bench and the long golden shadows that have now covered half the clearing. The shavings heap is a pale, curling mound that catches the slanting light and holds it softly, and the tools on the bench gleam in their neat row, the steel reflecting the sky in tiny bright crescents. The air has cooled very slightly, and the scent of beech is now mixed with the faint damp smell of the evening that is still a few hours away, but already sending its quiet messengers, the cooling of the soil, the thickening of the haze in the lower branches, the longer, lazier flights of the birds as they move toward their roosts. You do not think about any of these things in words, but you feel them in the slow, deep rhythm of your own breathing, and you know that the day has entered its final phase, a phase in which the work will wind down as gently as it wound up, the lathe slowing, the tools being wiped and put away, the finished pieces gathered and carried home through the darkening wood. But that is still ahead. For now you stand and let the peace of the afternoon settle into your bones, the same peace that has been accumulating ever since the first cut of the roughing gouge, layer upon layer, until you feel as solid and as grounded as the beech trunk at your back. The afternoon has now moved into that quiet, amber-colored stretch when the shadows of the beech trunks have crossed the clearing entirely and begun to climb the trunks on the far side, and the light that falls through the canopy has taken on a weight and a warmth that it did not possess even an hour ago. You have just finished the third leg of the set, its beads and coves matching the first two with the quiet precision that comes from a hand and eye that have been working together without interruption since the early morning. And now you stand the finished piece against the bench with its fellows, all of them leaning together like pale turned pillars that catch the golden light in long gleaming lines. The pile of shavings around the lathe has grown deep enough to cover the tops of your boots when you stand in your working spot, and the scent of beech is everywhere, warm and sweet and slightly dusty now that the top layers of shavings have begun to dry in the sun. You take a moment to brush the loose curls from your apron and to wipe your hands on the linen rag, which is by now thoroughly impregnated with oil and wood dust, and as you do this, you become aware of a subtle change in the way your tools have been cutting over the past half hour. The gouges have not become dull exactly, but the shavings are a little more crumbled than they were. The sound of the cuts a touch rougher, and the surface of the last leg, while smooth, lacks the glassy finish that a truly keen edge imparts. This is the wood's way of telling you what your fingertips already know. It is time to stop turning for a while and attend to the sharpening. Sharpening is not a separate task from the turning, but a continuation of it, a quieter phase of the same work, and you approach it with the same unhurried, methodical patience that you bring to the lathe itself. You go to the bench and lift down the oilstone case from its shelf underneath, a small rectangular box made of two halves of oak that fit together with a simple sliding dovetail. The oak is dark with age and polished at the corners from many years of handling, and the lid slides open with a soft, dry resistance that speaks of a wood that has lived in the damp and dust of the clearing for longer than anyone can easily remember. Inside the case sits the stone itself, a fine-grained blue-grey rectangle about the length of your hand and the width of 2 fingers, its surface worn slightly hollow in the center from the countless passes of steel that have crossed it. The stone has been soaked in oil so many times that it is permanently dark and faintly greasy to the touch, and it carries the same clean mineral smell as the oil that you will add to it in a moment. You set the case open on the bench, the lid laid aside, and you reach for the small horn bottle that contains the sharpening oil. The bottle is a cow's horn with a wooden plug in its tip, and the oil inside is a thin, pale liquid pressed from the seeds of a plant that grows in the village gardens, a slow-drying oil that does not gum up the pores of the stone. You pull the plug with a small twist and tip the bottle over the stone, letting 3 or 4 drops fall onto the grey surface. The drops bead up for a moment, trembling with the vibration of your hand, and then they spread out into a thin, glossy film that darkens the stone and releases a sharper, cleaner version of its stored scent. You rub the oil into the surface with the tip of your little finger, spreading it evenly from end to end, and the stone seems to awaken under your touch, its abrasive surface now ready to receive the steel. The first tool you select for sharpening is the roughing gouge, the workhorse that has removed the most wood today and whose edge, though still serviceable, has lost the ultimate keenness that a good bodger likes to maintain. You take the gouge from the bench and hold it in your left hand, with the blade pointing away, the handle resting against your forearm, and you bring the oilstone up to it rather than the gouge to the stone, because the tool is heavy and the curved bevel is easier to control when the stone is the moving part. This is a technique that you learned from the old man who taught you, a way of sharpening that keeps the gouge steady and lets the small stone travel over the edge in light, circular strokes. You begin at one corner of the cutting edge and work your way across, pressing the stone gently against the bevel at the exact angle that matches the original grind, an angle that your wrist knows so precisely that you never have to think about it. The stone makes a soft, rhythmic whisper as it moves, a sound like wind through dry grass, and a fine grey paste of oil and abraded steel begins to form on the surface, a paste that smells of metal and stone and the thin, clean oil. You work the stone in small circles, overlapping each one with the next, and your eyes follow the trail of the paste as it darkens and spreads. A slow, hypnotic pattern that marks the progress of the sharpening. After perhaps 50 or 60 circles, you pause and wipe the bevel with the rag, clearing away the grey paste so that you can examine the edge. The steel gleams back at you, and along the very tip of the curve there is a thin, bright line of new metal where the stone has cut away the worn edge and exposed a fresh, sharp surface. You check for the burr, the tiny microscopic curl of steel that forms on the inside of the gouge when the bevel is properly sharpened, and you find it by running the pad of your thumb very lightly along the interior curve. There it is, a faint catching sensation that is too fine to be seen but unmistakable to the touch. A slight roughness that tells you the edge is ready to be honed on the finer side of the stone. You turn the stone over in its case, revealing the second face, which is smoother and paler and used only for the final honing, and you add a single drop of fresh oil to this face. The honing takes fewer strokes, lighter and faster, and when you wipe the bevel clean a second time, the edge has a mirror-like brightness that seems to gather the golden light in a thin, sharp line. You test it gingerly on a scrap of shaving, and the blade sinks through the wood with no effort at all, leaving a clean, polished cut behind it. The roughing gouge is ready to go back to work. You set the sharpened gouge aside on the bench with its cutting edge overhanging the edge so that it will not be dulled by contact with the wood, and you pick up the spindle gouge next. This tool has a shallower sweep and a longer bevel, and the sharpening technique is the same, but the angle is different, a little steeper, because the spindle gouge does finer work and needs a keener, more delicate edge. You oil the stone again, a single drop this time because the surface is already well lubricated from the first tool, and you begin the slow circular stroking along the bevel, watching the grey paste form and spread. The sound of the stone on this gouge is higher pitched because the bevel is longer and the contact area is greater, and it sings a soft, metallic note that blends with the whisper of the beech leaves and the distant murmur of the wood pigeons. You work your way across the edge methodically, paying extra attention to the corners where the bevel meets the sides of the tool, because a spindle gouge that is blunt at the corners will not roll smoothly through a bead. Your hands move with the same steady, practiced rhythm that they use at the lathe, and the repetition of the small circles is as calming and as absorbing as the repetition of the turning cuts. When the burr rises on the inside of the gouge, you feel it with your thumb, a slightly heavier burr this time because the spindle gouge had grown a little duller than you realized, and then you move to the fine side of the stone and hone it away, leaving an edge that is so sharp it seems to disappear when you turn it flat to the light. The parting tool follows the spindle gouge, and this one requires a different approach because its cutting edge is a diamond-shaped point with two bevels that meet at the tip. You hold the tool in your left hand with the point upward, and the two bevels presented to the stone one at a time, working each side with the same small circular strokes. The parting tool is narrow, and its bevels are short, so the sharpening goes more quickly, but the angle must be perfect or the point will be off-center, and the tool will not cut straight. You sight down the length of the blade to check that the point is symmetrical, and you make a few final strokes to correct a tiny, almost invisible asymmetry that your eye caught before your conscious mind could register it. The parting tool, when it is sharp, has a wicked little point that glints in the light like a cat's eye, and you set it carefully on the bench with the others, its point protected by a fold of the rag. The flat chisel that you use for squaring off the waste ends of the blanks is the last tool that needs attention. It is a simpler shape than the gouges, a flat, straight blade with a single bevel, and sharpening it is a more straightforward matter of holding the bevel flat against the stone and drawing it back and forth in a straight line rather than circles. You oil the stone one final time, and the grey paste that forms is darker now from the accumulated steel of all the previous tools, almost black in the center of the stone. The chisel bevel wears a bright, even line across its width, and a fine, even burr rises along the flat back, which you remove by laying the back flat on the stone and drawing it once lightly toward you. The chisel edge, when you are finished, is a perfect straight line of silver that can pare a shaving thin enough to read through, and you test it on the edge of a scrap, watching the wood split cleanly ahead of the advancing blade. With all the tools sharpened and laid out in their neat row on the bench, you clean the oil stone itself. You take the rag and wipe away the grey paste, which has the consistency of thin cream and stains the linen a deep metallic black. The stone, freed of its burden of steel, reveals its original blue-grey color again, and you rub a fresh drop of oil into it to protect the surface before sliding it back into its oak case. The case closes with the same soft, dry sound, and you return it to its shelf under the bench, where it will wait until the next time the wood tells your hands that the edges need restoring. The horn oil bottle goes beside it, its plug pressed firmly home. The rag, now thoroughly blackened, you fold and tuck into a corner of the bench. It will need washing in the stream before it can be used again, but that is a task for another day. Now you stand for a while in the golden light with your hands resting on the edge of the bench, and you feel a quiet, deep satisfaction that has nothing to do with pride or achievement, but is simply the feeling of tools and body and wood, all being in their right places. The sharpened gouges gleam on the bench top, their edges catching the low sun and throwing tiny bright reflections onto the underside of a beech leaf that hangs low overhead. The clearing around you has grown noticeably cooler in the time you have been bent over the stone, and the haze that you first noticed as a faint suggestion in the lower branches has now thickened into a visible veil that softens the far edges of the wood and turns the more distant trees into grey silhouettes. The beech trunks, which were earlier grey and warm, are now a cooler, bluer grey, and the moss at their feet has taken on a deeper, richer green that seems to glow against the darkening earth. The light, that golden, heavy light of the late afternoon, has begun to fade as it edges, and you can feel the evening approaching in the same way that you can feel the approach of sleep after a long, physical day. A gradual, gentle drawing down of everything that was bright and active. You decide to take a moment to simply stand and absorb this changing light while your hands rest from the sharpening. You walk a few paces away from the bench, stepping over the shavings that have scattered themselves across half the clearing, and you stop beneath a particularly tall and straight beech that catches the low sun on its western face. The bark there is glowing with a soft, coppery radiance, and the tiny ridges and lenticels in the bark are picked out in sharp relief, every detail standing clear and precise in the slanting illumination. You reach out and lay your palm flat against the trunk, feeling the residual warmth that the wood has absorbed during the day, a gentle, living heat that is completely different from the heat of friction or fire. The bark is smooth and cool where the sun has not touched it, and your hand spans the transition between the warm and the cool, a boundary that feels like the threshold between afternoon and evening, made solid and real. You stand like this for a minute, maybe two, letting the quiet of the wood seep into you through your palm and your feet, and the back of your neck, until the low call of a distant cuckoo breaks the silence and reminds you that there are still a few more things to do before the day can be put away. You return to the bench and attend to the tool handles, which have accumulated a thin film of oil and dust from your hands and from the general atmosphere of the clearing. You take a clean corner of the rag, the part that is not entirely black with steel paste, and you wipe down each handle in turn, working the cloth into the smooth beechwood with a gentle polishing motion. The handles, already smooth from use, take on a soft satiny gloss after the wiping, and the beechwood glows with a warmth that matches the surrounding trees. You notice as you do this that each handle fits its tool in a slightly different way. The roughing gouge handle heavier and thicker to take the heavier cuts, the spindle gouge handle slimmer and more delicate, the parting tool handle almost like a pencil in its lightness. That all of them are beech, from the same woods, made by the same hands perhaps, and they all share the same quiet, understated quality that makes them pleasant to hold and easy to use for hour after hour without fatigue. The iron parts of the tools receive a wipe as well, a light film of oil applied from the rag to keep the rust from settling on the bright steel during the damp nights that will soon be coming with the autumn. You oil the blades from the tang to the cutting edge, careful not to blunt the freshly sharpened bevels, and then you lay each tool back in its canvas pocket. The roughing gouge first, then the spindle gouge, the parting tool, the flat chisel, all nestled into their own slots where the canvas holds them snug and still. You roll the canvas bundle from the end nearest the handles, folding it carefully so that the cutting edges do not touch each other or the fabric too tightly, and then you tie the roll with its leather thong, using the same simple knot that you have tied at the end of every working day for as long as you can remember. the tool roll goes onto the bench, ready to be carried home, and the bench itself is now almost clear, just the story stick and the water bottle and the few scattered scraps that will be swept away in a moment. You take a final walk around the clearing now, not for any specific task, but as a way of saying a slow goodbye to the day and to the space that has held you in its quiet shelter. You walk past the lathe, and you touch the overhead pole as you pass, feeling its smooth bark and the slight elastic give that still lives in its fibers, a reminder that the pole is still part of the living tree it once was. You walk past the shavings heap, and the smell that rises from it is warmer and more fermented now, the earliest stages of the slow decay that will turn these pale curls back into dark, rich soil, feeding the very trees that gave the wood. You walk to the edge of the clearing and look back at the whole scene. The lathe with its cord hanging slack, the bench with its few remaining items, the turned legs leaning against the log, the golden haze filling the air like a soft, luminous dust. The robin, which had been absent during the sharpening, flits down from a high branch and lands on the tool rest one final time, cocking its head at you as if to ask whether you are coming back tomorrow. You do not answer, but the bird seems to understand anyway, and it bobs its tail once and flies off into the grey-gold shadows of the wood. The day has reached that point, the point where the work is essentially done and only the packing away remains. But the packing away is still a chapter of its own, a slow and careful process of leaving the clearing as you found it, of loosening the lathe and coiling the cord and gathering the finished pieces for the walk home. That will come in a little while, after you have stood here for just a minute or two longer, watching the light fade from gold to amber to a soft, dusky bronze, feeling the temperature drop by another degree, and the first faint stirrings of the evening breeze that will sweep through the beechwood as the sun finally sets. The sharpened tools are ready, the bench is tidy, the pile of finished legs is a solid, satisfying record of the day's labor, and you are filled with a calm, steady tiredness that has no sharp edges and no urgency. You breathe in the cool, chalky air, and the scent of beech oil and sharpening stone and turned wood mingles in your throat, a taste that is the taste of a well-spent afternoon, simple and clean and lasting, like the note of a struck bell that hums on in the silence long after the bell itself has fallen still. The last of the golden light has now drained away into the west, and the clearing is filled with a soft blue-grey dusk that seems to rise up from the earth itself rather than fall from the sky. The beech trunks have lost their individual warmth and have become a single dark colonnade that surrounds you on all sides, and the leaves overhead, which earlier glowed with that translucent green, are now a deep, shadowed canopy that rustles with a sound that is quieter and more secretive than the brighter rustle of midday. You stand for a moment beside the bench with your hands resting on the cool wood, feeling the day settle around you like a cloak that has been slowly lowering itself onto your shoulders for the past hour, and you know without looking at any clock or sundial that the working day is done, not because you are exhausted, for the tiredness you feel is still that gentle, pleasant weariness of steady effort rather than any sharp fatigue, but because the light has reached that particular shade of grey that makes further turning impractical, and because your body, which has kept time with the treadle and the pole and the slow arc of the sun, is telling you in its own quiet language that it is ready to go home. You begin the process of packing away not with any sense of hurry or finality, but with the same slow, methodical care that you have brought to every other task since you first stepped into the clearing in the morning mist. The lathe must be left in a state that will preserve it through the night and the damp hours before you return, and this loosening and coiling is as much a part of the craft as the sharpening of the gouges or the selection of the blanks. You walk over to the treadle and crouch down, your knees making a small cracking sound that is swallowed by the softness of the wood chips, and you work the knot free from the iron ring that connects the lower end of the rawhide cord to the treadle board. The knot, a bowline that you tied this morning with a single practice motion, comes undone with a simple tug on the free end, and the cord slips out of the ring with a soft, leathery whisper. You coil this lower section of the cord loosely around your hand, taking care not to introduce any kinks or twists that might weaken the rawhide over time, and then you hang the coil over the tool rest while you attend to the upper connections. Standing again, you reach up to the spring pole and grasp the cord where it is tied near the tip, a point that is just above the level of your head. The knot here is a different one, a simple hitch that can be loosened by pushing the cord back against its own tension. And you do this now, feeling the rawhide slide through your fingers as the hitch comes apart. The cord drops free, and the spring pole, released from its constant gentle pull, straightens upward with a faint, satisfied creak, its tip rising a few inches higher into the dusky air. The pole seems to breathe out as it returns to its full natural curve, the tension of the day finally released, and it sways once, twice, very gently, before coming to rest. You gather the remaining length of the cord and coil it around your hand until you have a neat bundle of rawhide about the size of a dinner plate, which you then hang from a wooden peg that has been driven into the side of the right-hand upright post for exactly this purpose. The cord will hang there through the night, safe from the damp of the ground and the nibbling of the mice that sometimes explore the clearing after dark, and in the morning you will loop it back onto the lathe in a matter of seconds. The blank that you were turning, the third leg that you finish shortly before the sharpening, is still mounted between the centers, and you attend to it next. You take the mallet from its peg and tap the tailstock wedge lightly on its underside, driving it back 1/4 of an inch so that the tail center retracts and the pressure on the blank is released. The finished leg comes away from the centers with a soft wooden sigh, and you catch it in your hand and inspect it one last time in the fading light. The beads and coves are as they should be. The taper is smooth and even, and the little sound knot on this one has turned out to be barely visible, just a small dark fleck that will disappear entirely under the final smoothing. You carry the leg to the bench and lean it with the others, a small, neat collection of turned beech parts that now includes 3 legs and 2 stretchers, the makings of a chair that is already present in these separate pieces, waiting only for the joinery and the seat to bring them together into a single, useful thing. The remaining unturned blanks, of which there are still a few leaning against the far end of the bench, you gather up and return to the stack at the edge of the clearing. You carry them in an armload, their stripped ends pale against the darkening background, and you lay them carefully on top of the pile where they will be easy to find when you come back. The bracken fronds that serve as a roof for the stack have dried out considerably during the day, and you rearrange them with a few light passes of your hand so that they cover the fresh ends and protect them from any dew that might settle overnight. The fronds rustle under your touch, a dry, papery sound that is very different from the living rustle of the beech leaves, and a small spider that had made its web between 2 of the fronds scurries away into the shadows of the stack, its work disrupted but not destroyed. Back at the lathe, you take up the mallet one final time and tap the tailstock wedge fully home, closing the gap between the iron centers so that the 2 pikes press lightly against each other. This is a small precaution, a way of keeping the centers protected from the damp and the dust, and it also ensures that no bird or bat will fly into the gap and injure itself in the darkness. The wedge goes in with a soft final thud, and you hang the mallet back on its peg, where it will swing gently in any breeze that passes through the clearing during the night. The tool rest, the forked hazel branch that has supported your gouges through all the hours of the day, you slide back from the work area by pulling its peg and moving it to the rearmost hole in its supporting block, a position that tucks it out of the way and protects its worn fork from any accidental knocks. The peg goes into its new hole with a clean, dry click, and the tool sits there in the dusk, looking strangely bare, without a gouge resting on its arms. Now the sweeping up, you go to the bench and retrieve the small broom that leans against the back leg, a simple bundle of birch twigs bound to a short ash handle with a winding of hazel withy. The broom is a humble thing, but it has kept this clearing tidy for many seasons, and the twigs have worn down to soft, flexible tips that work themselves into the crevices of the lathe frame and brush out the fine dust that accumulates during the turning. You begin at the bench, sweeping the surface clean with a few long, smooth strokes that push the scattered wood dust and the small, fragmented shavings into a neat pile at one end. The sound of the broom on the wood is a soft, whisking whisper that seems very loud in the quiet of the evening, and the dust rises in a faint, pale cloud before settling back down onto the leaf litter. You sweep the pile off the edge of the bench and onto the ground, where it joins the larger heap of shavings, and then you move to the lathe itself. The lathe frame needs a careful brushing around the upright posts and the treadle, because the shavings have a way of packing themselves into the tight corners and the worn hollows, and if they are left there they will absorb the night damp and eventually rot the wood. You work the broom gently around the base of the posts, dislodging the curls and dust that have accumulated in the crevices, and you sweep them out into the open area where they can dry in the sun. Another day. The treadle board receives a few light strokes, the bristles sliding over the worn polished spot where your foot has pressed all day, and you brush away the fine pale dust that has settled into the grain of the ash. The worn hollow in the earth where your left foot always stands gets a careful going over with the tip of the broom, the soil smoothed out and the accumulated wood dust scattered into the general litter of the clearing floor. When you are finished, the lathe looks clean and orderly, its various parts clearly defined against the darkening ground, and it has the appearance of a machine that is sleeping, resting after its long day of work, waiting patiently for the next morning when it will be called upon again. The shavings heap you do not attempt to move or contain, because it is a part of the clearing's own slow cycle of growth and decay, and the shavings will slowly break down over the coming weeks and months, returning their goodness to the soil that feeds the beech trees. You do, however, kick the edges of the heap inward with the side of your boot, tidying its outline so that it does not spread too far into the working area, and you scatter a few handfuls of the fresh, clean shavings over the older, darker ones, so that the heap looks neat and fresh. A pale mound in the center of the clearing that will catch the morning sun when it rises. The iron parts of the lathe, the centers and the small metal fittings need a final protection against the damp, and you take the oily rag from your belt and give each iron surface a light wipe. The same way you wiped the tool blades, the oil film will hold off the rust for another day, and you work it into the crevices of the drive center's spur and the tail center's cone, with the tip of your finger feeling the cool, smooth iron that has been handled by so many other fingers before yours. The iron seems to drink the oil in, its surface darkening slightly, and when you are finished the centers gleam with a dull, protected sheen that promises they will turn freely and true when you next mount a blank between them. The finished pieces, the legs and the stretchers, are the last things to be dealt with. You take the hemp sack that you brought with you, a coarse, heavy bag that has been folded and tucked under the bench all day, and you shake it out once to dislodge any spiders or woodlice that may have taken refuge in its folds. The sack is sturdy and rough, woven from the fibers of the hemp plant that grows in the village fields, and it smells of the dusty, vegetable scent that all such sacks carry. You lay it open on the ground and begin to place the turned pieces inside. The legs first, their beads and coves nestling against each other with small wooden clinks, and then the stretchers, which are shorter and thinner and slip into the gaps between the legs. You arrange them carefully so that they will not shift and knock against each other as you walk, and you wrap the canvas tool roll in its own protective layer and lay it on top of the wood, where it will be cushioned and safe. The sack is heavy when you lift it, a solid, satisfying weight that represents the day's output, and you sling it over your shoulder with a strap that has been sewn to the bag for this purpose, adjusting it until the weight sits comfortably across your back. With the sack over your shoulder, you take a final look around the clearing. The lathe stands quiet and orderly, its cord coiled, its centers closed, its tool rest pushed back, its treadle clean and bare. The bench is empty except for the story stick, which you pick up and slip into a pocket of the sack, and the water bottle, which you sling over your other shoulder by its leather strap. The shavings heap is a pale, ghostly shape in the center of the cleared space, and the stack of unturned blanks at the edge of the clearing is a darker mound against the even darker wall of the beech trunks. The spring pole arches overhead, a thin curved line against the grey sky, and you can just make out the few small leaves near its tip, still attached and still alive, trembling slightly in the first cool breath of the evening breeze. Everything is as it should be, as it has been left at the end of many working days before this one, and the clearing feels not abandoned but simply resting, a space that will hold its peace through the night and be ready for you when you return. You turn and begin to walk toward the path that leads out of the clearing, the same narrow track that you followed in the morning when the mist was still clinging to the lower branches and the robin was just beginning its day. The path is darker now, the beech trunks pressing closer on either side, and you walk slowly because the footing, while familiar, is less distinct in the dim light, and the chalky soil has a way of hiding flints that can turn an ankle if you are not careful. Your boots make the same soft, crunching sound on the leaf litter that they have made all day. But now the sound seems louder because the wood around you is so still, the birds having gone to their roosts and the insects not yet begun their nightly chorus. The only accompaniment to your footsteps is the distant, occasional hoot of a tawny owl, a sound that is less a call than a long, low, quavering note that seems to be the voice of the dusk itself. As you walk, the weight of the sack sways gently against your back, and the turned beech pieces inside it knock together with a soft, muffled rhythm that matches your steps. You think about the cottage that you are walking toward, the low, timber-framed house with its roof of clay tiles and its single, small window that will show a warm light by the time you arrive, because someone has already lit the oil lamp and set it on the sill. You think about the bowl of soup that will be waiting on the hearth, the bread that will be cut, the chair that he will sit on while you eat, a chair that you yourself made on this very lathe, from beech wood gathered in this very clearing, its legs turned with the same gouges that are now rolled up in the canvas bundle inside your sack. The thought is a quiet one, without any particular emotion attached to it, just a simple recognition of the circle that the day has made, from the cottage to the wood and now back again, a circle that has been made by the Bodgers of these hills for more years than anyone can easily count. The path begins its gentle descent now, the slight slope that tells you are leaving the higher part of the wood and approaching the edge where the fields begin. The beech trees are starting to thin out, and between their trunks you catch the first glimpse of open sky, a wide, pale grey expanse that still holds a faint, fading wash of orange along the western horizon. The air changes as you walk, losing some of its deep enclosed woodland scent and gaining a fresher, sharper quality that carries a hint of the hay meadows and the chalky dust of the lane. A bat flits past your head, a small, quick, silent shape that you see only because it passes against the lighter patch of sky, and you follow its erratic flight for a moment before it disappears back into the shadow of the trees. The wood is behind you now, or nearly so, and the sounds of the village, the distant bark of a dog and the low murmuring bleat of a sheep, are beginning to reach your ears. Sounds that belong to a different world from the world of the clearing, but which are no less a part of the quiet rhythm of the Chiltern evening. You come at last to the stile that marks the boundary between the wood and the lane. A simple construction of 2 stone steps and a wooden rail that has been polished smooth by the passage of many hands and many years. You set your water bottle down on the top step for a moment, easing the strap from your shoulder, and you adjust the sack so that it sits more comfortably before you climb over. The lane beyond is a pale ribbon of chalk that runs between high hedges of hawthorn and elder, and in the gathering darkness the white surface seems to glow faintly, as if the lane itself were holding on to the last of the daylight. You step down from the stile and begin to walk along the lane, your boots making a different sound now, a firmer, sharper sound on the packed chalk, and the hedgerows on either side are alive with the small, rustling movements of the sparrows and the wrens that are settling down for the night. The cottage appears after a few more minutes of walking, a dark shape against the dark sky, but with that single square of warm yellow light in its window that you knew would be there. Smoke rises from the chimney in a thin, straight column, and the smell of the wood fire reaches you on the lane. A clean, sharp scent that is different from the sweet, nutty scent of the beech shavings, but which is, in its own way, just as much a smell of home. You unlatch the low wooden gate and walk up the short path to the door, and the stones of the path are worn into hollows by all the feet that have walked this same short distance from the gate to the threshold, feet that belong to the people who have lived in this cottage and worked in this wood and turned these chair legs for all the generations that have come and gone. You push open the door, and the warmth of the fire washes over you, and the smell of the soup, and the soft, yellow light of the oil lamp. You set the sack down just inside the door, leaning it against the wall where the finished pieces will stay until you are ready to assemble them into their chair, and you hang the water bottle on its peg by the door. The canvas tool roll you take out of the sack and carry over to the corner where you keep your tools, and you lay it on the shelf with the same care you have given it all day. The linen rag, black with oil and steel and wood dust, you drop into the basket by the hearth where the rags go to be washed, and you wash your hands in the basin of water that has been left on the stone sill, the cool water running over your fingers and carrying away the last traces of the beech shavings and the sharpening oil. Then you sit down in the chair that you made with your own hands from wood that came from the clearing, and you take the bowl of soup that is offered to you, and you eat slowly, without speaking, letting the warmth of the food, and the warmth of the food, and the warmth of the fire, and the warmth of the lamplight soak into your bones. The day is over, the lathe is silent in its clearing under the dark beech trees, the robin is asleep on its perch, and the turned legs and stretchers rest together in the hemp sack, dreaming their quiet wooden dreams of the chairs they will become. Outside the cottage window, the last light has faded from the sky, and the Chiltern Hills lie under the stars, the beech woods black and still, the chalk lanes pale in the darkness, and the whole world seems to breathe out a long, slow breath of peace.